Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Planning and Infrastructure Overview and Scrutiny Committee today, Thursday, the 17th of January 2013. The first item on our agenda is to remind all present, and this in particular applies to members of the public, that they should know where the fire evacuation exits are, which are there and there. This meeting is being webcast, which means that we are being webcast, so that those of you who have an interest in recording exactly what we've said and done can look at it at your leisure in due course. First of all, can I receive apologies for absence, please? Do I have any? No apologies for absence. Excellent. Resignations and replacements, I understand some Councillor Harvey.
It's not an apology for absence, but Councillor Watts will be attending a little late.
We'll welcome him when we see him. That's Gary Watts. Yes, I could see you here. I've got my glasses on, as you've noticed. I can see you now. Resignations and replacements. I understand that Councillor John Leake and Councillor Horace Mitchell and Councillor Cherritt have been replaced by Councillor Miller, Councillor Peach and Councillor Mrs Taylor. Is that right? Good. Oh, and Councillor Mrs Cubitt's been replaced by Councillor Tilbury. Welcome, Councillor Tilbury. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest or whipping decisions? Councillor Harvey?
It isn't, not this time.
Not yet.
A change, indeed. Having taken advice from the directors, from one of our directors, and actually having a lawyer look at the situation, I do not have a disclosable pecuniary interest, and therefore I will not be declaring one, and I should not have done previously. I didn't have one in the context in which it was previously said. So I am perfectly all right to sit here this evening, but just so we're absolutely clear, if there is any issue, I will say to walk out of the room.
Of course, and wouldn't have expected anything otherwise. Thank you. I'm not aware of any urgent items. Our first item is paper A, to confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 15th of November and the revised minutes on the 18th of November, I think it is. October. Ah, yes. Sort of do it backwards for various reasons. Firstly, is the meeting, do I have a proposer or seconder for the minutes as described on page 4 of 172 being accurate and correct? Yeah. Question. Is it a question?
It's an amendment to the minutes.
Oh, of course, yes. Please tell us.
Mr. McInnes's name is spelt McInnes.
And that's at the bottom of page 4 of 172.
That's correct.
Thank you. I suppose someone will get me something to sign, and I will sign the minutes. Okay. Proposer for those minutes being accurate, please. Thank you, Councillor Garland. Seconder, Councillor Shaw. Thank you very much. The next minutes are the October ones, the 18th of October. Can you just look at those, committee, please? Do I have a proposer that they're accurate? Councillor Gardner, seconder. Councillor Shaw, thank you very much. They are signed. Thank you. Well, members, we have, the item 8 is the member and public participation upon issues contained within the agenda. I'm sure it won't have escaped anyone's notice that a substantial number of members of the public and various councillors want to address our meeting tonight quite properly, because the items we have to discuss affect many of them. What we have looked at is the best way of dealing with that, the proposal will be in a moment or in a little while, and some of them have been asked not to come till 7 o'clock for the reason I'm about to explain, that we have the short officer presentation followed by so that the members of the public know exactly what we're going to discuss, followed by the members of the public giving their contributions. I will try and encourage the members of the public, because I have a list here, and I hopefully that covers all of you. You'll be you're committed to 2 minutes each. And if your submissions go on longer, of course, you're perfectly welcome to hand in your written submissions or email. We prefer email because it means it gets to people better than perhaps a piece of paper floating around. And I know that many members of the public have already emailed us, either on the basis they think that we need to hear it now or because they were unsure of whether they were going to get here. Can I say they have all found their way to the relevant officer, Mr. Hunter, wherever he is, he's over there, and or the portfolio holder. It's very important members understand that the most important people that hear this are the officers advising the portfolio holder and the portfolio holder himself. And it's his ears that everything that we are saying tonight have to get to, not necessarily mine, but of course if they get to me, then they'll get to him, if you see what I mean. I know many of you have addressed things to me, and I have forwarded them on. Can I just say this again for the benefit of the members of the public? We have a referral from the Development Control Committee about a planning application. Now, our constitution tells us that we have to deal with that before, at the very next opportunity, before we go do with any other business of planning infrastructure. That is why some of you hopefully got the communication to come here at 7. Because we need to discuss that. What I'm going to say to members is we are going to discuss that now, and at 7:05, if we haven't finished, it will go to the back of our agenda, because we have a duty to deal with that particular application as soon as we possibly can. But if it seems to be going on longer, well, tough, it will go to the back of our agenda, whether that means Monday next week or some other funny date, and we'll get on with the rest of it, because I need to hear from you, and many of you will be conscious of the fact that the weather is a bit inclement, and you'll want to get this out of the way as soon as you possibly can and get home, or you may choose to stay, obviously. So, unless anyone on the committee's got anything to say, that's what I propose to do, and we'll deal with paper B first of all. And can I ask that all members turn to paper B, which is the application BDB 77030, which is a referral as a departure from development plan policy. And I understand that one of the officers, possibly Miss Williams, Nicola Williams, is going to present the officer report on this, and then I've got a couple of words to say, and then, yes. Well, should we get the officer? You're going to declare some interest. Yes. There are members here who sat on the relevant Development Control Committee. The advice I have is as follows, that they are entitled to listen to the officer presentation. They're entitled to be questioned by us as to the reasons they made for their decision, then they must leave. Because as a former chairman of this committee frequently used to use the phrase, they would be marking their own homework, whereas in fact we're going to mark it for them. So that's very important. So Nicola Williams, please.
The application concerns the erection of a new dwelling in the grounds of Kilkinnon House in Upnatley, which is a listed building. The application has been referred up from the Development Control Committee meeting that was held on the 21st of November last year, where it was resolved to approve the application. Within the appendix you can see that the application was originally being recommended for refusal for 8 reasons. And it is acknowledged that there's elements of the refusal reasons that are subject to valued judgments. However, there are 2 areas that need to be brought to the attention of members for consideration tonight. No exceptional reasons have been identified by members of the Development Control Committee for approving a new dwelling in the countryside that is outside a settlement policy boundary, and this is shown in the reasons for approval within Appendix 1 to the report in front of you tonight. Also, the second issue to be brought to your attention is that the issue of contaminated land has not been adequately addressed. And in this regard, the Environmental Health Officer is here tonight to answer any specific technical questions that you may have.
What I was going to ask, but I was going to ask the committee members to put themselves forward if any of them want to explain their reasons for approval or refusal, or if you want to ask them any questions about that first. But Councillor Watts, is there anything that precedes that you want to raise? Oh, please do.
Paragraph 315 of page 20 of 172 says the site is not a rural brownfield site. So I looked at policy D9 to see what is the definition of a brownfield site, and that refers us to PPG3, which is a long withdrawn government document, and I've been unable to find it in the archives. So I thought, well, let's be up to date and look at the National Planning Policy Framework. Now, the word brownfield occurs 4 times in the NPPF, and on each occasion it says that the brownfield site is previously developed land. This report at paragraph 37 says that the land was once part of a brickworks, so, which sounds like previous development to me. So could the officers explain why they say it's not a brownfield site?
Mike Townsend.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the historic use of the site was as a brick kiln. However, that use is long since elapsed. Therefore, the use would be considered as abandoned. The site is effectively part of the countryside. It has no specific use on it or recent use on it. So the previous or historic use wouldn't classify it now as brownfield land.
Anticipate a question.
Well, no, I read it says previously developed land with no other qualification, and so I accept the NPPF, as we're constantly told, as the policy, and that's the way I'll approach this problem.
So what? So I'll remind you of that in a bit. Does any of the committee wish to ask Councillor Mr Taylor, Councillor Miller, or Councillor Mrs Tucker as to their reasoning or thinking for their views? Yes, Councillor Harvey.
I just want to ask, really, in terms of coming up with the reasons for approval, did you think on the night, was it in terms of debate, full debate, reasons for approval, you felt you satisfied the requirements there on the night in granting approval, or I guess otherwise you wouldn't have voted? It's a general question, but we were just putting it on the record.
Councillor Miller?
For the record, I didn't vote. That was one of the reasons I abstained.
Councillor Mrs Tucker?
Yes, I did vote, and I voted against because there's absolutely no reason why it should be passed, because it's not an exception in any way, shape or form under the rules of the Planning Committee.
Right, well, I'm going to ask those 3 members to withdraw. You didn't indicate, but now I know. Please, Mrs James. Or you want to ask Councillor Taylor? I didn't think she was volunteering to say anything. Councillor Mrs Taylor.
Well, I'm not volunteering it, I'm being asked it, which is fine, I've got no problem. I actually abstained because whilst I can fully understand the desire and the reasons given for the new home, I simply, having sat on the DC committee for some years, I know of no current policy which allows for a new house to be built in the grounds of a large house in an area with no SPB, in other words, a new dwelling in the countryside. So I would love to have found a good reason, because I think, obviously it does make sense, but I couldn't, so I abstained. Thank you.
Well, yes, it's been pointed out to me, but I'm sure you appreciate it. It obviously was a majority decision of the committee, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Right, the next thing, can I ask those 3 members to go? Thank you. Can I just ask members to concentrate for a moment on paragraph 3.10? And you will see that the reasons given for approval were: the proposed development would preserve and enhance the conservation area. The development would preserve the special architectural and historic interest of the adjacent listed building. The development would be of a high standard of design. The development would respect the environment for trees of high value. And the development would preserve the landscape character and scenic quality of the area. And the development would be in a sustainable location. I hope members are appreciating, and Councillor Watts has started to touch on the subject, that none of those are in any sense an exception to the policies. They may all be good, fair, proper reasons that you see in any other application for recommending approval, but they are not spelling out reasons for the exception to the policy. Our job in this committee will be to spell out if we think there are reasons for exception to the policy, or to spell out reasons why we say that there is no exception to the policy. All right, just a minute, Mr. Jones. Can I give you some examples? Councillor Watts quite properly talked about a brownfield site. So it is open to this committee to say, for instance, the site can be regarded as brownfield because there is no policy saying when a site no longer becomes brownfield and becomes open countryside, and the existing potential contamination from the previous industry on the site is still potentially present. So it's still potentially brownfield. It's open to this committee to say that the existing policy doesn't, that's an exception because the policies don't seem to define properly what to do in those circumstances. It's open to us to say that the site is located adjacent to other properties in a village environment and isn't therefore perhaps necessarily what one might call open countryside because it is somewhat enclosed by the existing other properties. It's open to us to say that that particular village doesn't have a policy in place at all for new homes, and we have to judge this particular application on its merits at this present moment. It's also open to the committee to say that the site is exceptional due to the size of the plot, and the policy doesn't deal with exceptional sized plots like this in the first place, which are, compared to many plots in the borough, this is massive in comparison. So all I'm saying to the committee is the development control hasn't done its job as far as justifying the exception to the policy. We need to decide if it is exceptional. I've given you some pointers to suggest that's the sort of area we should be in if we're going to go down that route. Conversely, you could all decide, well, actually, it's not exceptional, and there's no way you're going down that policy. I know a couple of you want to speak. Can I just mention one other matter? It's clear from the officer's report, and in paragraph 3.12, in looking at the reasons for approval, members of DC have not set out why. No, that's not the right one. Hold on a minute. Is that the right one? No, I was going to mention about the. In paragraph 3.7, I'm sorry. In terms of the sixth reason for refusal, the issue is that the land upon which the dwelling is to be sited was once part of a brickworks with associated pits and kilns. There is therefore the potential for contamination to exist in the underlying soils, and that infilling has occurred, which would present unacceptable risks to the new development and occupants thereof. It's my view, and I don't know whether it's committee's view, that we need to work out whether that's a showstopper in its own right. Because it seems to be the case in the paper, wrongly or rightly, that the applicant hasn't actually dealt with that yet. Now, it may have been dealt with in the meantime since this hearing, we'll find out. But if the applicant hasn't dealt with it, because ordinarily, if the applicant says, well, this is the situation, there's been a survey, it's all done, and the officers will say, well, if you grant approval, these conditions need to be met in order to make the site safe. If it hasn't been dealt with, I'd like to know from the officers whether that means that if approval was granted by DC, we as a council could be liable because we haven't actually gone through the proper steps in checking it's safe for a dwelling to be built. So could I have an answer on that? Because if it's not a showstopper, we perhaps don't need to consider it at all. Can we just go back to policy? Mr. Beer.
Well, the main issue with obviously the historic use of the site as a brickworks is obviously the potential for contaminants to be present in the soils at the site. If we grant permission with the condition, there's obviously an issue that, start that again. If we don't do an assessment up front, we don't know, the extent of any remedial works at the site, and how much if it's basically economically viable to remediate the site, so that any contamination doesn't present unacceptable risk to human health.
Perhaps I'll ask Mr. Townsend, what's the position? Should we be granting permission if we don't know the answers or not? If the answer is it doesn't matter, then we'll move on and just deal with policy.
I think the issue here, Chair, is that it comes down to the test of the reasonableness of applying a condition or not. There can be situations whereby you apply a contaminated land condition where you have a reasonable prospect of that condition being discharged. The issue here is because of the historic nature of the site and the potential for contaminants to come through, that first level, if you like, of understanding of what might be there isn't so far forward that we feel comfortable that a condition could reasonably be applied. On that basis, we consider that it is something that requires information up front and cannot be resolved by a condition.
Councillor Harvey, do you want to add anything or not?
And respecting the officers, and this is we're getting into debate here, and I guess shall I wait until you start that?
Well, we need to hear from the applicant.
Yeah.
Public speaker. Ignored it, or whether it's not a showstopper and the conditions can resolve it. I'm trying to get to the bottom of that issue.
I guess my point, Chair, in which cases, and with all due respect to the officers, there are inconsistencies because there are applications that have been processed previously where those very conditions were applied with the same concerns that Mr Townend has just expressed. So if we're looking for consistency of decision making at DC, DC has quite happily approved applications where it has not known the full extent of contamination issues relating to sites in the past, and been quite happy to condition them and have that condition be explored in order to fulfil whatever concerns the officers have had. So from a pure consistency of applying the policy and conditions point of view, we've got to be fair on this, and I don't think that's fair. So it's not a showstopper.
No,
It can be resolved because we've got much larger applications.
That does seem to be what the officers are saying as well. They haven't said the word showstopper to us. In which case, therefore, I think we have to ignore that as it's part of the conditions that would be applied if approval was granted. Can I explain to the committee, and then we'll go to the public speakers, the position? We have to decide if there are reasons for exception to the policy. All right, councillors, just to remind you, we have to decide if there are reasons for exception to the policy. If we say that there are, it goes back to DC and it's up to them to approve the application if they wish to do so. If we say they are not, it goes back to DC. They either refuse it or they send it to full council for consideration if they wish it to be approved. All right, so that's the position of where we are. Okay, let's now hear from the public speakers. First of all, Mr. Cubitt, please.
Good evening. I'm Hugo Cubitt, the applicant. Thank you for allowing me to make a few points regarding this application, which was approved by elected members in DC in November. The application to build a two-bedroom bungalow in the middle of the village of Upnatley is specifically to house my ageing parents. It will meet, in a small part, the stated objectives of the Council's core strategy under Policy CN3 to provide accommodation for elderly downsizers. It will be built to the highest standards and has been specially designed to meet lifetime mobility standards. Another stated objective of Policy CN3, 15% of all new homes need to meet this criteria over the new plan period. The details of this application were sent to 31 neighbours. Not one objection was made. Indeed, 2 unsolicited letters of support were received. Our parish council had no objection to this bungalow. Our parish council said the proposal would have, and I quote, an insignificant impact and will be well hidden from view from Blagrove Lane. So this application has had no objections whatsoever from any neighbour or no objection for the parish council. The reasons cited by the officers for refusal, as per the NPPF, related specifically to proposed new isolated buildings in the countryside. This bungalow is not in an isolated dwelling. The proposed two-bedroom bungalow is in the middle of the village of Upnatley. No trees will be cut down. The Section 106 agreement has been signed. A thicker membrane will be laid to address this yet unconfirmed fears that the site is contaminated. But the unregistered brick kilns, which are sited nearer to our house than the bungalow. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you will support my family and agree with DC's approval to this application, which, as I've said, had 100% support from our community, our parish council, and has received not one objection.
Mr. Cubitt, thank you. Please wait there. Are there any questions, Mr. Cubitt? Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Hugh, would you just give us an idea of what you mean in terms of the membrane, the contamination element in response to the conversation we've just had with officers? I think it's important you get a chance to say something on that. I'd like to know what you think.
If there is potential contamination, you can lay an additional membrane underneath the dwelling. And this has been proved apparently in Newnham, where a house was built next to a known landfill site, and this was passed by building control.
Councillor Tilbury.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Cubitt. Regard to the contamination, was that raised as an issue during the planning process? Were you given the option of producing a sort of report to go and dig the site up, because that's all it really needs to see if it's been either infilled or whether it's just been, in most cases, the clay, but they take the clay, just take the clay away. It's Did that come up as an issue during the planning process?
It came up, but they didn't request for anything to be done at this stage. But with the nature of the land, you can see where the clay was obviously dug out, and nothing has been infilled. So at the moment, we're left with just sand.
Mr. Cubitt, can I ask you a question? You said that people have supported. How many have supported, and how many people are in Upnately, roughly?
I'm not sure how many residents there are in Upnately, but we had 2 positive letters of support and not one objection from the 31 households it went to.
Okay, Councillor Watt.
Are you prepared to do a contamination assessment of land?
If a membrane is not regarded as acceptable, which it has been before in worse circumstances, yes, I mean, we would be prepared.
Okay. Anyone else on the committee want to ask Mr. Cubitt any questions? No. Thank you very much, Mr. Cubitt. We'll then have Councillor Goodson, please.
Right, thank you members, and thank you Chairman for allowing me to speak to you. You're going to have a long evening ahead of you, so I'm going to be very brief and confine myself to a few bullet points. Current policy states no new buildings in the open countryside. Borough officers, for whom I have considerable sympathy, are constrained by this ruling. I would make 2 points here. This policy is in the last few weeks of its life. It is to be hoped, indeed expected, that the policy which will become part of our next core strategy will have a more sympathetic attitude to new build in our villages. I would also like to point out that this policy takes no account of the fact that all parts of those communities with no settlement boundaries are deemed to be in the open countryside. The window box that you may have outside your kitchen is in the open countryside. This application is for a bungalow within a residential curtilage. Blaygrove Lane has no direct access into the open countryside. Residential properties line both sides of this lane along its full length. DC committee debated this application at considerable length and came to the decision that it should be approved. The Borough Council's legal fees in the sum of £931 have already been paid by the applicant, and the Section 106 deed of agreement in the amount of £824 has already been signed by the applicant. In fact, £1,650 of this amount has already been lodged at the insistence of the council with Pennington's. The borough needs houses. That is why you're all here this evening. The applicant needs a bungalow for his aged parents who are finding it difficult to manage on their own without assistance. I feel that common sense prevailed at the development control meeting, and I would ask you to confirm their decision to approve this application. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I've got a question to ask you. So your exception would be that your exception is that residential properties line both sides of the lane, and the application site is in the curtilage of the existing property, and therefore not in the open countryside.
I fully accept.
Is that what you're saying?
Well, I accept that the policy states that if there's no settlement boundary within a community, then everything is in the open countryside. I would just suggest that in view of the particular circumstances of this development, that's a somewhat absurd ruling, and hopefully will be replaced in the not too distant future.
Okay, and I've broadly got down what you were saying correctly. Thank you. That sounds like I have. Thank you. Can we have an officer comment on that, Mr. Townsend, please?
Oh, sorry.
Asking Mr. Townsend to agree or disagree necessarily what the Councillor Goodson has said. but that could be a basis for finding exception to the policy.
I think that would be difficult, Chair, because on the basis of there being lots of different villages which do not have settlement policy boundaries and therefore are considered to be within the countryside, although I appreciate the definition of countryside and what people might anticipate as envisaging what countryside is, may not necessarily be the same as planning designations. In terms of whether that is truly exceptional, my view would be that it's not exceptional for those reasons. This is something which could be repeated in lots of different locations across the borough, and therefore wouldn't provide that exceptional circumstance.
Questions for Councillor Goodson, please. Councillor James? No? Questions for Councillor Goodson? Go on then.
I remember sitting on other committee meetings of P&I where we've had exceptions within, I think it was either in Basing or whether it was in your own ward. Is that the case, that there has been exceptions to this? I think it was Mr. Bell's, or it was an example, and that was for one development.
We had the first case we had was in Maple Durwell, where it was ultimately deemed that the new build could be said to be in an annex to the main house building. The other example, as you've just mentioned, was Mr. Bell's up in Newnham, and on that particular occasion, the argument that was an intrusion into the open countryside was a little fallacious, as it was next to a 63-bedroomed nursing home which had been passed by the borough council without any query about that being in the open countryside. On that particular occasion, there were concerns because there had been a tip apparently used for a short time, for I think 3 years, while an existing tip was being changed within 200 meters of this particular house, and it was decided by the environment people that in the circumstances putting this membrane on the footprint of the entire house would be sufficient to ensure that there were no gases coming up, from that particular situation. Thank you.
Councillor Goodson, thank you. Now, we are approaching debate on this, and look at the time. It's 4 minutes or 3 minutes past. I've got members of the public there, and I know what happened last time I tried to push the members of the public off. They got very grumpy with me. So I'm going to postpone discussion on this, I'm afraid. We know what the issues are now. We know what we've got to discuss, and it might allow some of you to formulate some good arguments, either for or against, of what we need to consider. I'm afraid I do want to put this back, and I do want to deal with members of the public. What I will do is this. We'll see how we do with members of the public first. Councillor Shaw, don't delay it too much because they'll blame you.
I just wanted to ask a question of the officers if they were about to leave at this stage.
Asking them, well, yes. Let me just... to the applicant. Mr. Cubitt, could you come forward? Sorry. Mr. Cubitt, you appreciate it's very important for a whole host of reasons this application has to be considered properly by the committee. I'm concerned that we've got members of the public. I don't want to delay them any further. I've consulted with the officers about whether we put this back and after we've heard from all the members of the public tonight. But that would potentially mean that the officers hang on to an unknown hour tonight and not necessarily getting there. The proposal I'm putting forward, and I hope you can be here, is to put this at the start of our business on Monday at 6:30. Are you able to be here then? Thank you. Well, that's what I propose to do, and we'll begin our debate and discussions, and we'll have the relevant officers here. Thank you. Right, we'll move to paper C now. Just wait for it. Yeah, go on. Get the presentation on. Go on. Well done. Members and members of the public, first thing I want to just say to you, members of the public, is this, before we have our officer presentation, is this, that the comments that we make tonight, all members will come to look at the sites and judge them by the assessment criteria. Certainly in relation to one, maybe more than one site, there have been planning applications recently. And it is very important that the members here, and to some extent, but I'm sure members of the public can say what they like about recent applications, but it's about the sites themselves and the assessment criteria which you need to address your comments on. The members here will have to bear in mind two things. One, if they sat on development control and voted in a particular way, if they expand upon their reasons for voting that way on a particular application, their comments tonight could be taken forward by the applicant and considered as relevant material. So if, for instance, today they say, well, I said this for a particular reason, which turns out to be a non-planning bonkers reason, it will undermine their credibility in the appeal. So watch out, address your comments to the site. Secondly, as some members of the public will know, and all members of this committee will know, it's very important that members, when considering sites, do so with an open mind. Any suggestion that in relation to any site, and I say this bearing in mind there have been some applications and members may have expressed opinions on those specific applications rather than the sites themselves, it's very important that they're not seen to have closed minds, because we, as an authority, if members on this committee could be shown to have closed minds, could be subject to challenge by others who say, well, because you have closed your minds to these particular sites, it has consequences for the sites that we're concerned about. So I just say that as a caveat, and I think we all know what we mean by that. So the officer presentation first, and then I will assist members of the public with their public speaking. Mr. Lambert and Miss Bromley to assist us, please.
Thank you, Chair. We're just going to give a short introduction to the paper. Should flag up to members that a supplementary report was published on Monday, which should have been circulated to all members this evening. I should also flag up that we are aware that this is a very sensitive issue that we're discussing here this evening. The identification of sites for inclusion in a local plan is always a difficult process. However, we do recognise that it is important to have a plan in place so that we can start to identify locations for development and avoid planning by appeal. Just a short background to what we're going to talk about this evening. Joe and I will go through the background to the housing number requirement and the levels of development that we need to accommodate. Additional work that's been undertaken, then to go through the different approaches to distribution across the development across the borough, the key settlements in the borough, and then the rest of the borough as well. Before moving on to the overall suggested officer way forward, and then outline the next steps in the process. So to recap and provide you with an update on where we are, housing numbers were considered by this committee back in October, and there was a subsequent decision of Cabinet in October. Cabinet identified that the likely housing requirement should be in the region of 730 to 770 homes per year over the period 2011 to 2029. We've also got some background work going on, which we've called Critical Friend, and this is to consider the methodology and approach that councils use to work out the housing number. As per the process last year, we've undertaken site assessment and a sustainability appraisal of all the Category 1 SLA sites. Members will be familiar with those sites from previous discussions. We've also reconsidered some of the yields, and I'll flag these up as we go through the presentation. And members will also be aware that we've been undertaking some work on neighbour planning with some of the parish councils in the borough. We've now had 4 applications from Bramley, Sherborne St John, Sherford-on-Loddon and Whitchurch. And a protocol has been discussed by the committee in the past as to how to take forward neighbour planning, and that goes to Cabinet on the 29th. In terms of the housing number, the figure of 730 and 770 has been identified by Cabinet. Over the plan period, this gives us a requirement of just over 13,000 to be accommodated, and up to 13,800 at the higher level. Taking into account those homes that have been built over the last year, which totalled 693, leaves us with a requirement of around 12,500 up to just over 13,000. We need to factor in into the equation those sites that fall into our land supply position. That includes planning permissions that have been granted, allocated sites that have yet to be built out, an allowance for windfall development, and sites within the settlement policy boundaries in the SLA effectively, which totals just over 5,000 homes. Furthermore, we can take into account those regeneration opportunities that may come forward, which totals 200 homes, and a potential for neighbour plans to deliver some housing, which delivers 150. In total, this leaves us with a requirement to plan for of just over 7,000 homes and up to 7,800 homes at the higher end of the range. Thinking about how we accommodate this across the borough, members will be familiar with this process, as this is the method we used last time round, and that was to look at 3 different approaches, the first of which was to focus all the development in and around Basingstoke town, the second approach being to focus on Basingstoke town and the other main settlements in the borough, or finally to look at a spread across the whole of the borough and to allocate sites where there's SPBs. The approach that we're suggesting is as per the approach from last year, and that's to focus development in Basingstoke town with a spread to the larger settlements. This is the approach that we feel is most likely to be delivered, is most closely aligned with the evidence base, and helps to meet housing need where it arises. It also locates development where there's existing services and facilities. In terms of settlements, this means Basingstoke, Bramley, Kingsclear, Oakley, Overton and Tadley and Whitchurch. And these settlements have been identified because of the services and facilities available in each settlement, local housing need, the availability of SLA sites and the outcomes of the site assessment work. In terms of sites, for Basingstoke, officers are suggesting that the following sites are allocated for development. This includes north of Popley Fields, Razors Farm, and members will be familiar with many of these, north of Rosers Farm, and it should be noted that the yield here has changed from the last time that this was considered. Swing Spang Lane, east of Basingstoke, and I should highlight at this point that officers are suggesting that this should be allocated for 900 homes. Members will be familiar with the Hampshire County Council's position as landowner, and they're suggesting that the site should be put forward for just 400 homes within the plan period. This appears to be based on the County Council's operational approach to managing its sites, and it doesn't appear to reflect a specific planning or an infrastructure constraint which inhibits the comprehensive development of the site. Therefore, we're suggesting that 900 homes would be appropriate in this location. Moving on, we've identified the golf course, Redlands, Cuffold Farm, Kennel Farm, and in addition to these sites, we've identified specific parcels of land within Manydown for allocation. These are shown on the plan before you. With regard to Manydown, you'll be able to see that there are two specific areas that have been identified with the outline in red there. We've also highlighted the hatched orange area, which shows that part of the site which we considered should be considered through further master planning for any necessary infrastructure to support the development.
Okay, turning to the settlements, starting first with Bramley. There are two Category 1 sites in Bramley which are identified in the Schlar, namely Minchin's Lane to the north of the village and Strawberry Fields to the east. Both of these sites were put through the site assessment, and Strawberry Fields was found to have more constraints. However, for this particular village, because of the progress that's been made by the parish council in terms of neighbourhood planning, it was considered that it would be more appropriate to give them a number rather than actually allocate a site, so that could be decided more locally. In terms of the number of 200, that is based on a number of factors that Mark touched upon, such as local housing need in the village, the size of the village, settlement facilities that are there, etc. In terms of Overton, there are 5 Category 1 sites highlighted in the Schlar, which are spread around the village. Each of these sites were put through the site assessment, and as a result of that process, also again the size of the village, the facilities there, and also the local need, it was considered there should be 2 allocations in Overton. That's what the suggestion was. These are highlighted on the map, if you can tell them. They're the 2 red sites. There's north of London Road, which is to the northeast. We suggest that's allocated for about 120 houses. And then you've got Twoggate Lane, which is further to the southeast, which would be allocated for 150 houses. The report also suggests that this development, the site should be phased across the plan period to allow the village, I should say, to be able to accommodate that level of development and ensure that housing need is met throughout the plan period. In terms of Tadley, as you'll probably be aware, the relative proximity of the atomic weapons establishment is the main constraint to development in that location. There remains uncertainty about the level of development that can take place in that area, and as a result of that, the report suggests that there shouldn't be any greenfield allocations specifically. Instead, there should be a policy in the local plan which will address these issues and could potentially bring forward small-scale development, such as infill development. I'll flag up here that the most up-to-date position in terms of Tadley is outlined in the supplementary report to the main report. Moving on to Whitchurch, there are 4 Category 1 sites in Whitchurch. These were again all assessed through the site assessment. In light of that process, and also similar factors again as local housing need, the facilities in the town, and the size of the town, the report suggests that the site should be allocated towards the west, actually 2 sites towards the west of the town, which would total about 150 units. But also that a number should be allocated for 200, which again reflects the progress that this town has made in moving forward with neighbourhood planning, so further development can be decided locally. Again, the report highlights the need for phased development across the plan period in the town. In terms of the slightly smaller settlements of Kingsclear and Oakley, the report suggests allocating numbers. 50 in the case of Kingsclear, and 200 units in the case of Oakley. This reflects the size of the settlements and the facilities, local housing need, the fact that there's been limited development in recent years, and also the sites, Category 2 sites that are highlighted in the SHLA. Those numbers would be, the location for future development would be determined locally, again, via such routes as neighbourhood planning, reviews of settlement policy boundary, etc. In terms of the other settlements, options for achieving development are listed there, which include neighbourhood planning, affordable exception sites, potentially a future review of SPBs, but also development within the existing SPBs.
Just really in summary of what we've said, the total number of homes that have been identified on the sites and broad locations for development comes to just over 7,800 homes. Taking into account the 730 and 770 range, it leaves us with a buffer of just over 700 houses for the lower side of the range, and just 7 houses at the top end of at the higher end of the range. This may cause us some potential issues if sites fall away over the plan period as we move forward, and so we've suggested some potential remedies to consider. This is potentially the identification of a reserve site, a future review of SPBs, taking into account those Category 2 sites in the SHLA, or potentially a commitment to review the plan in 5 years' time, and members' views are sought on which one of these options they would find favour with. Moving on to the next steps, after the meeting of P&I this evening and on Monday night, Cabinet will be seeking Cabinet endorsement of the sites numbers. Cabinet will be presented with a supplementary report to pick up on the comments and views of the P&I committee from the next meetings. There will subsequently be a drop-in session for members on the draft policies during February, and then we'd move on to look to considering the pre-submission draft of the local plan in March, such that public consultation can be undertaken in May, June. Just like to leave you with the recommendation.
Officers, thank you very much, and the committee appreciates that we've got a number of jobs to do in due course. We've got to discuss the housing land supply, number 4, the components there, and then move on to the distribution, the policy that's been put forward, and then we move on to site assessments. What I'm going to do for the benefit of the members of the public and the councillors who also want to address us is try my best to group you into the 7 areas that we will be looking at in due course. The 7 areas that are within our paper are Basingstoke, Bramley, Overton, Tadley, Whitchurch, Kingsclear and Oakley, in that order. Now, I can't promise to get that exact, and I know that a number of you will want to be addressing between, say, for instance, Bramley and Basingstoke, and I will call you in the Basingstoke lot for that purpose. Can I also remind and perhaps tell some members who may not have come to this type of meeting before, it's very important that you stick to the time limit, which is 2 minutes for all. That applies to councillors, whether you're regulars here, whether it's your first time. It's very important because if you go beyond that, you'll be taking up other people's time. And as I said, if you have additional comments, you can send them in. Secondly, please address all your comments to me as chairman, not to anybody else around the table. You can address them through me to the portfolio holder, but it's to me. Thirdly, no personal comments. It should be obvious, but sometimes people feel so passionate that about their particular where they live that they get rather carried away. Please don't get carried away, because we want to hear what you've got to say, and we don't want personal comments. Can I also tell you that although this looks like a political process, it isn't a political process. Whichever party or parties were in power in this council, we would be having to conduct something like this, or virtually the same as this, at this moment in time, or we would have done it already. It has to be done. It's a requirement. The only thing to say, Councillor Ms James, what do you want to say? I'm trying to address the public, Ms James.
I'd just say that we would approach it very differently.
Yes, Ms James, I was just about to say we will not be playing politics here tonight. We will be listening, and I think that's probably Ms James, hopefully, her last comment on that subject. because at the end of the day, it's a fact-finding exercise. We want to get to the facts to support the views that you have, or facts that support a particular site, or facts that say a particular site that shouldn't be chosen. And it's very important that those facts come through to us and that the portfolio holder hears them. So I'm going to begin, and the first person I'm going to ask, I hope they're here, it'd be funny if they weren't in the circumstances, is Mr. Little. Oh, there we are. Next person I want to ask is Patrick Murphy, please. Thank you. What I'm going to ask, once you've sorted yourself out, is just you tell us first, before you begin to speak and before I time you, just tell us what you're going to talk on and who you are and where you're from, so we get our papers in order and we can take a short note of what you're going to say. Tell us firstly who you are and where you're from.
Yes, good evening. My name is Patrick Murphy. I live in Cufford Lane, Bramley, and thank you for the opportunity to address this committee.
There we go. See, I've breached it already. I've gone to Bramley, but never mind. You're here now.
No. Well, you'll see why I'm here.
Okay.
I'm talking about AKA Bramley, with the sites in a moment.
Which sites do you want to talk
I'm going to talk about BAS 107 and 122. Okay. But if I'm allowed, please, just to make the comments I'm going to make, I'm sure.
Yes, that's fine.
This preamble is not counting towards the...
No, it is. I haven't started the timer. That's the whole idea. We know who you are. We're off and running.
Yeah.
Off.
Start the clock, Bruce. Right, okay. Before going into detail of the sites I wish to comment upon, I think it needs saying that if the council had not acted unlawfully and irrationally in the last slot, when it excluded Manidown, we would not be looking at a requirement for 13,000 new homes. In fact, we'd only be looking now for some 2,900, because 6,000 have suddenly materialised as being already anticipated. And that balance of 2,900 would have been more than covered by the, albeit partial inclusion of Manidown now. The latest slide proposes 1,030 new homes for Bramley Parish, which, given the go-ahead, will materially change the rural character and environment of the parish. The two specific sites I wish to refer to, 107 and 122, are for 810 homes, i.e. Razors Farm and Upper Cufford Farm, which are in Cufford Lane, Bramley. Looking at the overarching policy choices in section 5 of the report entitled Distribution, there's been many complaints from the very first draft SLA in 2010 that denoting the sites as BAS was willfully wrong. If denoted correctly as BRAM prefixes, as the sites are in Bramley Parish, these sites would have failed under the same issues as failed the choice listed in paragraph 5.7 of this report. The end result would be that the committee would be sitting here this evening with a different proposal on the table. Furthermore, Bramley Parish Council have started the NDP process incorporating this land in their NDP, these two sites. In this same section, the report says that the council do not want to be seen to be acting top-down, imposing developments on parishes who are developing their NDP. Razors Farm falls in the logical band that was existent in earlier borough plans to preserve the spaces between settlements. The original borough policy of maintaining strategic gaps should be reinstated. The committee must reject the proposal of these two sites until accurate, up-to-date traffic surveys are being conducted and traffic plans formulated that will ensure that the proposals in the SLA do not bring misery to drivers using Cufford Lane and the roads in Chinham, Sherfield Park and Chinham Business Parks. For those of the committee who do not know Cufford Lane, it is entirely unsuited to deal with any increased traffic flows, as it is a country lane with, in many places, a single carriageway with cutouts provided for vehicles to pass each other. The lane forms part of the national cycles network, but cyclists will be put at more danger if even more traffic than users already as a rat run to the Chinham Business Parks is encouraged. Well, let's go to my conclusion then, yeah. With no provision for railway station at Chinham, the commuters in these new developments will be drawn to Bramley Station, which will result in even more traffic going down narrow Cufford Lane. Final paragraph. Finally, I remain unconvinced that more homes could not be generated on land bought for the specific purpose of development, namely Manidown, which would preclude the need for the development of these two sites in an area already struggling to cope with infrastructure shortfall. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. The next speaker, I would... What?
Chair, I'd like the officers to explain what they mean. They say Bramley. Do they mean Bramley Parish? Do they mean the village of Bramley? Or do they mean the ward? I'm getting very confused. And then we have sites being mentioned which are outside the Venn diagram of the three areas that I mentioned. What exactly are we talking about?
The prefixes in the schlar are those, if it's a BAS, it's got a BAS at the front of it, essentially it's on the edge of Basingstoke, whether it's in most of the edge of Basingstoke sites are in other parishes. Those which have, say, a Bram at the front of them tend to be in and around Bramley Village, so there's a difference between the two. So some are considered in terms of meeting the needs of Basingstoke, if you like, and some will be meeting the needs of a smaller village.
Next speaker is Sandra Tapping, please. That's it.
Press the big black one.
That's it. Say it again.
Sandra Tapping. I'm a resident of Chinham, and I wish to talk about Razors Farm, Cuford Farm, and east of Basingstoke, which in fact really is east of Chinham. I object to Razors Farm being in the draft local plan for immediate development. There's a natural edge to North Chinham at Crockford Lane, and the woodland forms an important green barrier. Allowing Razors Farm to coalesce with Chinham and Taylor's Farm would put a huge immediate burden on the local infrastructure, especially taking into account the other proposed sites in the east of Basingstoke. It is an unacceptable anomaly that many better sites adjacent to Manidown are excluded under the excuse of coalescence, whereas expansion in the Chinham area would be a massive coalescence. There are already major congestion problems on the A33 east of Basingstoke. Further development would create an unacceptable increase in traffic on the A33 and at times lead to gridlock. This would have disastrous consequences for the whole of the Basingstoke economy. Please resist the short-term option of overloading infrastructure by piecemeal development on greenfield sites in the Chinham area. Manidown would bring forward the best sustainable opportunity for new infrastructure as a result of the scale of development being suggested and is in single land ownership, which is beneficial from a deliverability perspective, and this is highlighted in paragraph 6.14 of the officer's report. Finally, I urge councillors to reject the inclusion of several eastern sites, especially Razors Farm, and to concentrate on bringing forward plans to develop in a sustainable manner in the west. This would provide better economic prospects for the future of Basingstoke as a vibrant business community. Thank you.
The next speaker is Margaret Towsey, please. I hope I pronounced that properly. Okay. Just say who you are and what you wish to speak on, please.
I'm Margaret Towsey. I live in Cuford Lane in Bramley. I'd like to speak on the Razors Farm site.
Okay, please go ahead.
I choose to live in the area because of the countryside. I'm aware that Basingstoke has to have new housing, but the local plan seems very heavily laden with developments in the northeast of the borough, which is very unfair. The numbers of houses in the Manidown site appear to have been reduced. This is in an area with good links, feeding into the major road network with easy access to the motorway system, much better than Chinham or Bramley. Looking at the housing officer's report, it would seem there have been no real traffic surveys in the Bramley-Chinham area, and there is no plan of how to deal with the substantial additional traffic that these developments will create. Each house usually means 2 cars, so if you double the housing numbers, to get how many cars will be dashing along the local residential roads and lanes. The local infrastructure is just not capable. The A33 is already badly congested, as my previous colleague has mentioned. Any ideas that you or the developments have that children will walk to school is just not realistic. The roads are already dangerous, and on the lanes without pavements, it's suicide. Cyclists already have a tough time, and with more traffic in the lanes, their lives will be more dangerous. This is a time when we should be promoting safer cycling, especially on marked cycle routes. The report talks about enriching the character of the local area and protecting flora and fauna. Somehow this seems at odds with the local plan. It also states that these sites would not lead to coalescence between Bramley and Basingstoke. Kerfode Farm is no longer a reserve site, and if Razors Farm is developed and then Kerfode Farm, Bramley will become Bramstoke. This is an area already suffering flooding. Once the fields are lost to concrete, the water will have no choice other than to go onto the roads. There does not seem to be provision for this in the plan. How will you, the planning office, face your grandchildren when they ask why there are no more fields or nowhere to work, walk or play? You will have to admit that you were part of the team that made the decision. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Keith Hawkins, please.
Good evening, my name's Keith Hawkins. I'm Assistant District Commissioner for Basingstoke East Scouts. And I'm here to talk about BAS 107, and it's also relevant to BAS 104 and 121. Basingstoke East Scouts are a multi-faith, multicultural organisation that provides life-enhancing opportunities for young people, both boys and girls, from 6 to 25 years old. We're a non-political organisation and a charity. We believe wherever new housing developments are built, there needs to be community provision and, more importantly, facilities for young people. Scouting is growing at its fastest rate since the 1970s. We cannot cope with demand for places, and a new development will bring new families into the area. Parents will naturally be keen for their youngsters to take part in worthwhile, enjoyable activities like scouting. We offer fun, challenge and excitement that youngsters crave, and we'd like to see provision for Scout and Community Hall within the new developments. We'd be happy to run these for the benefit of the community. We already have a Scout and Community Hall in Chinham, where more than 200 young people a week enjoy scouting. That's not just one night a week. The hall is used every single night of the week and is at capacity. It's also used extensively during the day. Therefore, what we ask is your consideration of any development. There has to be provision for community and its young people. A community is only a community if there's infrastructure and facilities within it to become a community. Therefore, we would urge you to ensure that a community facility is essential in any new development which may be granted.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Nick Bywater, please.
Nick Bywater from Sheffield Park. BAS 107 provides a gateway to BAS 122, and in combination, these sites represent a significant northward shift in the settlement area of Basingstoke. These sites are inconsistent with the town's compact shape and are poorly related to other residential areas, being separated by the railway line and business parks. The sites will be constrained by inadequate traffic connections to the existing highways network. At peak hours, this will increase traffic volumes on local roads to capacity and will exacerbate current overcapacity on the already hazardous A33. The two sites lie immediately north of the Hampshire International Business Park, and the residential development of BAS 107 alone would permanently restrict the growth of this employment hub. I would suggest that alternative sites for business and manufacturing uses may, in the future, be more difficult to establish than alternative sites for residential use. The short-term benefit of housing gain must therefore be outweighed by the longer-term loss of employment growth. BAS 107 is adjacent also to the proposed site for the Chinham railway station. This site is unpopular locally, as it would destroy the established woodland buffer between the residential areas of Chinham, Sheffield Park and the railway line itself. BAS 107 is a more logical commercial site for this use. For these reasons, I believe that BAS 107 and BAS 122, and to a certain extent BAS 139, logically BAS 139 are both, or are all three inappropriate sites for residential development.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Elaine Still.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, members. I'm here tonight to talk on BAS 107, Razors Farm. And I'm here tonight in my capacity as the ward member for Chinham and county councillor for the Loddon Division. And therefore I'm here to represent my residents and a number of the residents' views, which you're already listening to. This site borders on and is accessed from Hampshire International Business Park, and I don't consider this site suitable for housing as it's hemmed in by the industrial sites and the railway line. It was always my understanding this site would be used for the proposed Chinham railway station, car parking and indeed employment land. I want to make clear I am not opposed to all development. I live on a large development, Taylor's Farm, and a very good development it is too. But this site, as it is at the moment, quite frankly, has too many problems, and you know what they are: infrastructure. If this site goes ahead, there will be a huge traffic congestion on the already overloaded highway network, especially at junctions with the A33. The A33 is already over capacity. Development on this site would increase very substantially the traffic through North Chinham and Taylor's Farm, and it would become a rat run. I'm also very concerned if this housing development goes ahead, there will be a huge impact on our already overloaded sewage works, water, not to mention schools, medical facilities, shops, which incidentally we're still waiting for on Taylor's Farm. And indeed, if sites BAS 121 Cufford Farm, SOL 002 Redlands and BAS 121 Pirates Hill go ahead, then Chinham will see a major development area of another 200 houses, and this is quite unacceptable as we are already hemmed in. So to summarise, all potential sites to the east will share A33 congestion, an environmental impact, air quality issues, and thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Councillor Tomblin.
Evening, Chair, members. It's disappointing to see only 3,080 houses that have been identified for Manydown when the Manydown Executive Committee had suggested 4,000. Manydown, I believe, should take the whole of the borough's need to 2029. Sufficient infrastructure is already in place to see an earlier start, and the release of the funding to the borough would more than pay for the ideal infrastructure. Other sites will not be able to find the infrastructure in the same way, such that it will be lacking. I'm worried that Basingstoke's adopted vision will not be achieved with a local plan that is lacking master planning for all sites, and in particular the north-east part of the borough, where we will impact local communities with issues that we currently have no answer for. Traffic modelling is not ready for this critical decision stage of the local plan, so how can members select sites without this information? All potential negative impacts of sites have been identified, and these will have to be addressed by mechanisms to ensure sustainable development. These mechanisms have yet to be clearly identified, and therefore there are no predictions of their probability of success. So to be fair to Basingstoke's residents, we should not allocate sites until this is all in place. Now, you've heard some specific site negatives about Razors Farm, Cufford Farm. We've got infrastructure problems, traffic problems, all sorts of impacts on the environment. The Cufford Farm, for instance, has an existing thriving residential agricultural business on there. It's been rated as strongly negative assessment for accessibility. It will only work if 107 comes forward. So everything is so linked together. It's also, just as of interest, a broadband not spot. It doesn't have broadband. Other Bramley sites to be assessed by neighbourhood planning. Okay, that's pretty good. Bramley's community has grown 4.5 times in size since the late 80s with no additional infrastructure. The suggested SLAR sites are on good usable land. The primary school, though, is full, and the secondary school has limited places. Neighbourhood planning at the moment is untried and places a large responsibility on parish councils to act as the planning authority. The choice of housing distribution will be dictated by a developer, however, such that the placement of houses is likely to be constrained to the existing sites identified in the SLAR. And then moving on to the east of Basingstoke.
Councillor Tomlin, your time has run out, so if you could reach to a conclusion.
Right, the conclusion is of those sites there, we have air quality problems, and also we have the impact of the incinerator. The chimney of the incinerator grounds in the area of 121 and SOL 0002, and I think really the Borough Council should be looking at adopting a precautionary principle for these sites, and this certainly would not fit our adopted vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say, I've been asked by the officers, just for making sure we get all the points through, if members of the public wish to leave their notes for the officers to have, that's fine, you don't have to, but if you wish to do so, or you want to email them in shortly, they'll give you an email address, a generic one, you can send them in if you haven't already got it. Thank you. Next, do we have Mr. Mayor here? Councillor Bierman? No, not. He's wearing his robes tonight. Councillor Mr. Still, what is it, please?
Sorry, I meant to say 2,000 homes, not 200,000. That's the nightmare I'm having.
Yes. Thank you. Next, can we have Rachel Price, please?
Hello, good evening. Rachel Price, speaking on site BAS 122. My name is Rachel Price and I'm the new tenant farmer along with my husband at Upper Cufford Farm, which we recently took over on a 7-year tenancy. My farm is run as a traditional mixed farm business with emphasis on rare breeds. I already have volunteers attending the farm, and it's my hope to build links with the community so that more local people can come and benefit from it through our school, college, work experience, employment opportunities for the future. I've already been approached by residents of Bramley asking to come and actually paint at the farm. My farm is the only starter farm within Hampshire County Council that I'm aware of that gives someone young like myself an opportunity to grow their business with the hope of getting a larger farm at the end of the tenancy, and so passing my farm on to another family. To me and my husband, getting Cufford Farm was like winning the lottery. It not only offers us a home, but a chance to expand my business. We don't come from a family farming background, so how else do you get the chance to run an 80-acre farm in Hampshire without having considerable wealth? We fought off 50 applicants for our farm, which I believe reflects the lack of opportunities into farming, and our farm's importance from this perspective is not to be underestimated. Significant amounts of money have been invested by Hampshire County Council and by ourselves, invested to help turn Cufford not just into an operational farm, but into a thriving business and an asset to Bramley. If our farm is built on in 5 years, then me, my husband and all my animals are to be evicted. You will not destroy only my home, but also my business. Publicly speaking to you tonight has been extremely hard, as it's something I fear most. But my shaky hands will be worth it if it secures Cufford for both my family, the farm's future, the wildlife that calls it home, and for any future families that get the wonderful privilege I've been given. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Price. I think we all noted your courage, and well done. Can I move on to the next speaker, which will be David Thornton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's David Thornton. I chair planning for Chinham Parish Council. Most of the things that I was going to say this evening have already been said most eloquently by previous speakers. But the one thing I think that does need pointing out is particularly with both BAS 121 and Razors Farm, these are both gateways to further development. They're gateways, the further developments in the case of Razors Farm, it's the Cuffold Farm, and with the BAS 121, it's the Lodge Farm 102 and 103 Poors Farm. Now these sites make sense only if Razors Farm and the land east of Basingstoke are developed. And these seem to be the most contentious sites of all these. These are the ones with great difficulties both in access and in their surroundings. The Razors Farm one has been already much ventilated, and I have little to add except to agree emphatically with what's been said. But with BAS 121, there's one point which I think hasn't been made very often, if at all, and that is that if this site is developed, it precludes future development of the A33. Now the A33 was once planned to be made into a dual carriageway with bypasses to places like Church End. If 121 is developed, then that opportunity will be gone. And I think members should think hard that there is no road north out of Basingstoke which is any good at all. And I think to create facts on the ground which will preclude future development of the A33 would be rather unwise. I'd also like to agree with what the other speakers have said. We have not really got onto the east of Basingstoke sites yet, such as Lodge Farm and Poors Farm, but there again, I think it can be summed up by to put dense development around a sewage works, a floodplain, and a rubbish incinerator seems rather foolish. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Clive Pinder.
Good evening. Solve has always wanted to work constructively with this committee to help ensure our borough balances its planning obligations with its residents' wishes. We commend the officers for proposing a revised LDF that we believe is more balanced, rational and indeed lawful than the one originally approved by the administration. The keywords here are proposing, balanced, rational and lawful. We believe there are two areas where the officer's current proposal falls short on the issues of balance and rationality. The first is the housing number target. The Conservative administration ran on a platform that it would support a target of only 595 new homes a year. We're now looking at a greater than 30% increase in that number. This despite the fact that our Conservative MP has expressed severe concerns about the ability of Basingstoke to cope with this level of growth. The same MP, who is also a Cabinet member, has advised officers and the Cabinet that it is still the government's intention to revoke the South East Plan and the principle of centralised targets. It's clear that the infrastructure, especially water and sewer provision and transport networks, are already failing to meet demand, so will clearly not support additional substantial growth. And there is plenty of statistical evidence that the 594 commitment can be justified to a planning inspector, and Solve has produced a paper on this which we've shared with the planning portfolio holder. We urge this committee to follow the counsel of our Member of Parliament and adopt a precautionary approach to housing numbers by lowering the target until all these issues are resolved. Secondly, given that the national planning, the NPPF, prohibits, and I quote, prohibits development anywhere that increases the number of people or property at high risk of flooding or is likely to increase the severity of flooding elsewhere, we urge members to question why the principle of sequential testing for flood risk is not being adhered to in this plan. There are many Category 1 sites that have been made available by landowners that the officers have chosen to exclude. For example, land at Hounsome Fields and around Worting has been excluded. Yet under sequential testing, these sites which are suitable, achievable and available would be prioritised above sites to the east of the borough that score the highest in terms of flood risk. Their exclusion means less suitable sites that are I'll start again. Their exclusion means less suitable sites that are more likely to flood have been selected. This contravenes NPPF obligations and opens the council up to planning challenges and liability claims from residents. In conclusion, we believe there remains a real opportunity for this committee to improve on the officer's proposal and avoid future planning or indeed legal challenges by A, taking a precautionary approach when agreeing housing numbers, and B, by insisting that sequential testing be applied to all Category 1 sites before final selection is made. These amendments, if acted on by the committee, will ensure the plan is balanced, rational and lawful. Thank you.
The next person is Peter Broyce, please.
Peter Bloyce, B-L-O-Y-C-E. I'm speaking tonight on behalf of Country Watch, who unfortunately can't be here because the main speaker has actually got a touch of flu or something. But anyway, tonight, and they have actually put in a paper to the committee, which I would just go down highlighting the main points on their behalf. Yes. First of all, one of the points which is sort of to the edge of this really debate, the borough lacks a wide green policy which must be included in the local plan process. Without it, it would render the report and this whole process unsound. But my main point, or the main points from Country Watch, is about BAS 121. 121 is, it fails the adoptive vision, which states that we create inviting places and communities where people want to work and live. Well, sewage works, incinerator, do you want to live there? I'm sure you don't. Also, I tell you what, Mr. Little wasn't here tonight because he's so worn out writing 4 pages about the incinerator and the Chinham sewage works to give to you lot to read, which I'm sure you all have, so you know all about that now. The sequential point about flood risk ranking and so on, that's another thing. It fails the NPPF on that. Environmental Agency has identified this site as inappropriate for development and recommended removal. Hampshire and Isle of Wight Trust, Wildlife Trust, said they were extremely concerned and regarding the impact on biodiversity. Landscape capacity study recommended Area B, that's north part of 121, should not be developed. And part of the larger scale development north and east includes, of course, Sol 0002, which on its own is undesirable for development. The eastern boundary of this site, 121, etc., bears no relationship to topography. Development would create a precedent, which someone else has mentioned a couple of times, for further major growth to the east. And it may even open up the chance of a bypass to the east, which would totally destroy the Loddon Valley area. There's biodiversity in the Loddon Valley would be contrary to national policies, the destruction of that. The River Loddon is currently failing to meet good ecological status and it's not been demonstrated that the Water Framework Directive has not been met. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
nearly there.
Concluding paragraph, please.
Yeah. And I just end up by saying that there are other sites that haven't been put in here in the thing, and like Hounds Mill, Houndsome Parks, working sites, etc. They should all be in there and before 121. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs. Cubitt.
Good evening, members. Thank you for letting me speak to you tonight as a visiting councillor about a site in my ward of Basing. I wish to speak about BAS 121, otherwise known as East of Basingstoke or Piatt's Hill. As per the MPPF, in para 100, it states, local plans should apply a sequential, risk-based approach to the location of development. Furthermore, in para 101, it states, the aim of the sequential test is to steer new development to areas with the lowest probability of flooding. And it says, explicitly, development should not be allocated or permitted if there are reasonably available sites appropriate for the proposed development in areas with a lower probability of flooding. The MPPF goes on to say the strategic flood risk assessment will provide the basis for applying this test. So the MPPF could not be clearer. The documents that the officers cite as the main evidence for this site selection are on the website today and include the Sustainability Appraisal Volume 1. On page 138, officers state in relation to BAS 121 that, open inverted commas, the sequential test should be applied in the first instance, and if there are no alternative sites, the sequential approach should be applied and the risks should be addressed through adequate mitigation. The strategic flood risk assessment has been done on all the available Category 1 sites. BAS 121 scores the highest ranking at a ranking of 8, and yet available sites that score lower rankings have been discarded by officers. Surely, this contravenes the explicit NPPF requirement that developments with a lower ranking must be allocated first. Only if there are no alternative sites can the exceptions test kick in. So members, through the chair, there are alternative sites named in this paper tonight. Members, they are available. The sequential test has been completed, but it has not been applied. Why? Members, one thing is certain. If tonight you allocate BAS 121, I believe, as do many others, that the Council will be in breach of the MPPF, and your decision will result in a greater increase in the risk of flooding to our residents. Is that best for Basingstoke? Thank you. I just asked one question. On the screen, the public's not up. Does that mean that the public and the public comments are on the web? Because we just got that. Normally, the public's...
We're being webcast, I'm told. It's on there. Now, do we have the mayor here yet? No. Right, in which case we are going to move geographically slightly. I hope I've dealt with the east, the north, and everyone who wants to speak on the east and the north has spoken, excluding Bramley, obviously, at the moment. Edward Davis, please.
Good evening. Edward Davis to speak about BAS 104. Over the past year, I and the other residents of Sherburn St John have been defending the land north of Marnell Park, also known as Popley Fields, from development. At the two hearings aired in this very room on the 4th of July and the 19th of September last year, the Council refused both applications to build on this land unanimously, 15-0. For 18 reasons that I do not have time to go into this evening, you'll be glad to hear. I find it beyond belief that despite 100% support from this very council, including many of you sitting around this table at the moment, development on this land was seen as a bad idea. You are now considering this area for development. The council's decision is going to appeal in April and is being supported by your officers. What kind of message are you giving when in one breath you're protecting this land from David Wilson Holmes's appeal, whilst with the other you're looking to develop it? This is illogical, and watching this strategic suicide is deeply frustrating, as it will be the villagers of Sherburn St John that will be impacted by this urban sprawl you appear to be pursuing. It is also frustrating the lack of vision being shown, where the current plan appears to be dropping in as many developments as possible of modern houses into the countryside, when there is the Manydown site that could deliver the council's housing target until 2029, with a planned infrastructure and community to go with it. This site lies outside the settlement planning boundary in open agricultural land, where residential and other development proposals are restricted within the settlement policy boundaries. Development in areas of SPBs is not permitted other than exceptional circumstances. I would suggest there are clearly no exceptional circumstances that would justify the proposed development. The site is clearly not sustainable, and the proposal would manifestly not protect and maintain the rural landscape and character of the locality. It seems that officers are ploughing a separate furrow to the council. This is an inappropriate location for development. Please reject it from the plan. Thank you.
Julian Crawley, please.
Good evening, Chairman, members. My name is Julian Crawley. I'm representing the Sherburn St John Planning Integrity Group, which we call SPIG. I'd like to talk to you on BAS 104, and in particular draw your attention to the Basingstoke officers' site assessment conclusions for this site. Firstly, the report directly contradicts councillors' findings as recorded in the notice of refusal for BDB 7561 and 75762, as just noted previously. Secondly, the report suggests limiting the extent of development on the site to mitigate its impact, but does not reduce the number of houses it proposes, i.e. it sticks with 450. The third point is that the report omits to note that half of the site is at an elevated height, significantly increasing the visual impact of the development. The report also omits to note that the site was rejected by the inspector at the last local plan inquiry because of its elevated position. Furthermore, the report dismisses major sewage infrastructure issues as something that can be easily sorted out, even though current pollution levels breach EU guidelines. Indeed, the Vine Brook, which crosses the middle of the BAS 104 site, is the most polluted watercourse in the borough. Basingstoke is a partner with Thames Water in providing these services, and it is directly responsible, and elected members cannot allow officers to brush this issue under the table. Thames Water has made 3 formal submissions recording that the local plan is unsound. Thames Water records that significant improvement and extra capacity is required, and that there is no current funding in the AMP5 programme for 2012-2015. Thames Water has not considered problems with water supply. That's the responsibility of a different supplier. The report furthermore omits to mention current water abstraction rates at 97% of maximum allowable from the aquifer. And finally, the report omits to mention the designation of a significant area of Basingstoke and its surroundings, including Popley and Sherburn St John, and the whole of the Basingstoke aquifer as a nitrate vulnerable zone. This is a significant cause for concern, and not just for BAS 104. I would suggest that this is an inappropriate location for development, indeed as most of the sites north of Basingstoke, and I would respectfully ask you to remove it from the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crawley. The next speaker is Mrs. Natasha Rougier. She's here.
Hi, I'm here as a member of Sherburn St John Parish Council. I wish to discuss BAS 104 north of Popley Fields, which is also known, I think, as land north of Marnell Park, BDB 75761 and 75762. You've already heard that this site has been unanimously rejected by the Planning and Control Committee on 2 occasions, and it has been the most objected to proposal already in Basingstoke and Deane. Any argument that this was rejected due to prematurity is just not true. In fact, the members of the committee made it clear that they were very aware that prematurity may not be a valid reason for refusal, but came to the conclusion that there were numerous other reasons not to approve development on this site. BDBC is now claiming to be fully committed to opposing the appeal by David Wilson Homes. It is completely illogical to therefore propose it for development at the same time. Firstly, this will severely prejudice the appeal itself. How can you be serious about fighting a development and promoting it at the same time? What message will this send to the inspector? Secondly, it's completely unnecessary. If the appeal is successful, the site will immediately be developed regardless and doesn't need to be included in this. If the appeal is refused, it's extremely difficult to see how you can then back such a development. In addition to this, I'd like to refer to some other issues that haven't yet been covered by my colleagues. Firstly, I'd like to draw your attention to the BDBC Office's sustainability appraisal conclusions in relation to environmental sustainability. I quote, they claim there is potential for development to have a negative impact in terms of the SA objectives to protect and enhance the distinctiveness and quality of the local landscape, avoid the risk of flooding and the detriment to the community, protect and enhance local biodiversity, flora and fauna. The adverse impact on the European protected species of the great crested newts is of great concern, and particularly in view of the recently completed Marnell Park development and the cumulative impact. The Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust believes that this policy to be legally non-compliant, against national policy, non-compliant with European directives and unsound because of the impact on the newts. In addition, the preservation of the open countryside between Popley and the village of Sherburn St John has been a scene of key importance by successive planning inspectors and is a vital element of the character of the local area not mentioned in this report. On social sustainability, the report admits an adverse impact on Popley residents. The services are hugely insufficient by their own admission. We've already brought to officers' attention also the huge underestimate of traffic levels resulting from this proposed development and the inadequacy of local roads, and we've already heard about the impact of the A33 and A340.
Time, please.
I therefore conclude that this is an inappropriate location for development, it is illogical and prejudices the appeal the Council have promised they are committed to fighting. Remove it from the plan.
Suzanne Dennis, please, or Dennis if I've pronounced that wrongly, I'm sorry.
Good evening. My name is Suzanne Deness, and as the chair of Popley Islands Community Group, I'm here to speak on behalf of our community in Popley, which would be directly affected by the development of the proposed site BAS 104. Anyone reading Appendix 3 could be forgiven for thinking that the planning application hearings heard by the Development Committee on the 4th of July and 19th of September never happened. Rarely has a planning application such as the one made by DWH to develop this site last year attracted so much local resistance and condemnation. It was refused unanimously. So has nobody been listening to us, the local community? Leaving aside the landscape, environmental and traffic issues, which we care about too, but others have dealt with more eloquently, the bottom line is that the local community neither needs or wants this site to be developed in the near future. It is in the wrong place and at the wrong time. In the last 5 or 6 years, our community has been ravaged by overdevelopment and all the chaos and misery which comes from living in the middle of a building site. About 2,500 new homes have been crammed into our neighbourhood, and Merton Rise is still yet to be completed. Common sense alone should dictate that any community subject to such rapid ongoing expansion should be allowed to recover, find itself again, and build new relationships. Common sense should dictate that the impact on the infrastructure of the huge recent increase in population should be allowed to settle down to allow for proper evaluation before any further development is considered. And common sense surely should dictate that you should learn the lessons from Popley's past history about what happens when communities are rapidly and artificially created so insensitively. The long-term costs of such mistakes are incalculable. Please listen to what the people who live here have to say. In 10 or 15 years' time, we may be ready for this conversation, but not now. In the last few years, we have already sacrificed too much. Please remove this site from the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Franken, please.
Thank you. I will be brief because I think a lot of the reasons and arguments have been very eloquently said by the parish of Sherborne St John and residents. I'd just like you, the one thing that I haven't heard anybody say so far is that this is outside the settlement boundary and it's in open countryside. And government keeps on saying that they will not be encroaching on that. So please don't go against what's being said by residents. You've heard about on the planning that the planning application was unanimously rejected. And for all the reasons said tonight, I'm absolutely pleading with you to reject the site of BAS 104. Thank you.
Councillor Paul Franken, please.
He's unable to make it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I should say Councillor John Leake was also unable to make it and has emailed some or all of us as well with his comments. Then the Mayor is here, so we'll go back to the north and east. Mr. Mayor, if you're here, would you like to join us, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure whether that build-up helps or is...
2 minutes.
Yeah, yes, I hear. And because of it's only 2 minutes, I can't sort of address the merits and demerits of individual sites. So I'll just leap straight into and talk about what I think really this meeting is all about anyway, and that's good strategic planning.
Okay.
I would like to think that if I was a councillor representing a ward along Roman Road, that I would say the same things as I'm about to say now. The trouble is that what I say might be tarnished by a suggestion of NIMBYism, but I can assure you that my feelings about where housing should be put is just as strong, irrespective of my, my particular area of representation and indeed dwelling. I am going to suggest very strongly that the majority of the housing be placed in Manydown. The reason I say that is it was bought for that very purpose. And at the time it was bought, it wasn't just bought casually as a nice idea. It was bought because it was decided that that's the way one could do sensible, cohesive, strategic planning. By rejecting Manydown, or now more or less rejecting it and taking it bits and pieces, one defeats the object of having purchased it for strategic development. It has been argued we didn't want an MDA. Look at the other side of Basingstoke. If that isn't an MDA, I would like to know what is. Certainly in terms of quantity it's an MDA. The trouble is it's got the mass of an MDA without having the benefits of an MDA. Manydown offers opportunities. Those opportunities are to do a really groundbreaking, and just look at the Gazette last week, continued this week, eco-friendly, leading edge development. One has that opportunity. One has the opportunity to do wonderful infrastructural things when they should be done at the start, rather than trying to catch up with the infrastructure as houses go in. Manydown has that benefit. Unlike the north of Basingstoke, one only needs to look at the map, and I'll take Prince Charles as a quote on this occasion. There's a massive carbuncle, isn't there, on the top of the Chinham Business Park. The Chinham Business Park is occupied by businesses who moved there thinking that they would have the normal expectations and freedoms of being a business. Already we have an application in for Razors Farm that would intrude on the normal business operations of a very important company, Air Products, who are going to be possibly impaired in their work because of the sound and the sound from the noise from their factory and the possible dangers from the sort of products that they handle. So with that, I'll leave you with the thoughts of a senior education officer who was talking about schooling in our area and said it's so difficult to predict what the schooling and education needs are in this part of town because it depends on so many factors and which bit comes forward and which doesn't. If only it were developed on Many Down, because you can put the schools in and put the houses in to suit it. Think of that. Thank you very much.
Paul Beavers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I have to say is quite different, I think, from what everybody else has said up to now. I chair the Old Down and Beggarwood Wildlife Group. My name's Paul Beavers, and I try to represent wildlife in debates at this council and discussions at this council and what's happening to the natural world. I'd like to speak about two things. One is Many Down, and clearly tonight there is a determined view, which may well be well thought about, to see Many Down turned into a very large housing estate. From my perspective, and I don't live anywhere near there, I happen to know that ecologically this is quite an important area, a very important area. I also know that Basingstoke does not have the benefit of a significant country park, which it needs. And perhaps, one way or another, the council will give this a lot more thought as part of the planning process, rather than just delivering a plan which deals with houses. The only thing that's in the plan at the moment is houses, and also we have the country park that goes beyond, which only goes to the minimum required by the agreement over Many Down. My feeling was, and there is still in the agreement room for manoeuvre, it seems to me, is that Basingstoke deserves better than a small country park in the northwest of the town, when the rest of the town could do with something far more substantial that more people from the town can access. So I don't agree with the idea that the whole of Many Down should be developed. I have put forward reasons in the past to council with arguments and reports on the ecology of the area, which some of you may be aware about. We need a park that serves Basingstoke, not just the northwest, as I said. Can I go on to my next point, my final point, which is section 6.13, and this may sound very parochial to you, but I would like to raise an issue without prejudice to any site selection decisions. It's about BAS 114 and BAS 133. Because we're interested in ecology, and we find that planning in the past has really let down the natural world, the natural environment, the woodlands, we would like that to be recognised as the MPPF required. England now only has 2.6% of ancient woodland cover, and these sites are right beside ancient woodland. We would like, as I've put in some notes, to see a 50-metre buffer requirement for those ancient woodlands. We cannot have what we've had in the past, which is complete destruction of our ancient woodlands. And we've had a 50% decline in ancient semi-natural woodland in Hampshire in the last 70 years. Thank you.
Stafford Napier, please.
Good evening. Once again, I'm Stafford Napier. I'm speaking on behalf of the South Western Action Group. I probably won't get any applause, mainly because I'm going to perhaps raise some inconvenient planning truths. It was ironic that on the very day that the Gazette launched its Green Town, Green Borough campaign, that the officers published their recommendations on the selection of sites, which included the two sites, BAS 114 and 132. And if you want to follow along, perhaps para 6.13 of paper C might be useful to see. These again include the rather irrational selection of the two sites for 1,250 houses in the far southwestern extremity of the conurbation at Kennel Farm and Basingstoke Golf Course. As I've reminded you many times before at this committee, statistics show that the people who live in the existing southwestern areas already travel further to work than people from anywhere else within Basingstoke. And that includes the rural areas, and their journeys are predominantly by car, again more than anyone else in the borough. The reason is easy to see. They live further from all the major employment areas in the town. They live further than anywhere else, from 80% by size of any of the major employment areas of the town. And their proximity to the M3 simply encourages them to get on the M3 and travel further. If you want it in a nutshell, it's great for developers. They love it, but it's lousy for our environment. We estimate that by building houses on these dormitory sites, rather than on sites which are nearer the main employment areas, which are in the north and the northeast, that are closer to those jobs in the town centre, will add about 240 tonnes of produced carbon dioxide to our atmosphere each year. That's equivalent to about 100 cars. Finally, in here it says that officers would like to see a western and southwestern focus for development, and it will have a minimal impact on heritage. I just remind you again that Basingstoke Golf Club is one of the, or golf course is one of the last 4 remaining James Braid designed courses in the county. It has a heritage, and to dismiss it as cavalierly as the officers have done, then I think that's a bit of a shame. So, further from the town, further from jobs, people will be in their cars. That is not green. Thank you.
Julian Jones, please.
Great. Julian Jones, Chairman of Dummer Parish Council. I've been Chairman since 2000, when the vision for Many Down was still one seen by this council. If I can restate the summary of the vision highlighted for this evening's site selection paper. In 2026, Basingstoke and Dean's people, community and businesses will be flourishing, enjoying an excellent quality of life, which has been improved through well-planned growth. I think we have to avoid the irrational and illegal development plans on this iteration of the LDF. The LDF Leisure and Recreational Needs Assessment, for which the borough paid, prepared by Kit Campbell Associates in September 2008, assumes that the population of the borough is likely to increase by about 24,000 between 2001 census and 2026. Now, maybe when we had a housing number of 597, we didn't think we'd achieve that. I think now with the 730 to 770 per annum, we will see that population growth reached, and therefore we can assume that the recommendations in this assessment are correct. There's also an assumption that the population will age in this period, and therefore there would be an increase in the need for recreational facilities for the over 45 age group. And this would include informal activities such as walking in the countryside. The conclusion of the assessment was, as regards golf courses, that the council's spatial objectives for the golf course should be to protect the existing provision and to support further development of those courses or clubs closest to the town centre in order to minimise the travel to those courses. Okay. Clearly it doesn't recommend building 1,000 houses on Basingstoke's oldest golf course, which, as staff has just said, was designed by James Braid, who won the Open 5 times. I'd also recommend remind the committee that for those informal activities in the countryside, the Basingstoke golf course abuts Peak Copse, which is a sink, and the Wayfarers Walk runs along the boundary with Peak Copse. Building these houses on that site will destroy the rural character of that area and that section of the walk.
Mr. Smallman, please. Very happy for you to pass them out if you've got enough copies for us. Yes, thank you. And now, yes, that's fine. And then we'll wait until they've got them before you start. Please carry on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Smallman. I'm a planning consultant, and I'm here this evening on behalf of Flavia Estates and the Worting Land Trust, who own most of the land north of Worting Road, Worting, specifically sites BAS 106, 115 and 116, identified in the council's SHLA, and you have the relevant extract before you. My clients fully support the proposed allocation of Manidown. It clearly presents the best opportunity to create a truly sustainable urban extension. It is also sequentially preferred in terms of flood risk, having regard to the MPPS requirements to select lower risk areas before high risk areas. However, it is entirely illogical to exclude from the proposed development area the land at Worting. Your SHLA confirms that development at Worting is suitable and achievable as part of a wider, more comprehensive west of Basingstoke urban extension. Worting has the potential to form an attractive, mixed-use area at the heart of the new neighbourhood. It could provide attractive public open space against the backdrop of a listed building and within an established landscape framework. It could provide workspaces, both existing and new, centred on Worting Park. It could provide opportunities for increased permeability and connectivity, and it could provide further housing. Incorporating Worting within the master planning process would present the design team with a precious opportunity to create a new urban extension with a strong sense of place and identity based on a historic core. We suspect that Worting has been excluded simply because it's a designated conservation area, but that's far too simplistic. There is no reason why new development should not take place within the conservation area, particularly as large areas of this conservation area are recognised as not containing key heritage features. I've also distributed the extract from the Worting Conservation Area appraisal, which demonstrates that, I think, very graphically. If Worting is excluded, a wonderful opportunity will be missed to secure high quality development and deliver community benefits, all of which can be done without harming the significance of heritage assets. We estimate that my client's land could accommodate between 300 and 400 additional houses. That's additional housing that could help relieve the pressure to allocate more sensitive sites, for example, in the Loddon Valley. Worting scored high on sustainability and low on flood risk. Its inclusion is not only logical in terms of master planning, but it's supported by the council's own SHLA and was recommended by the previous local plan inspector.
Thank you. The next speaker is Councillor Rob Golding. Yes, he is.
Right, thank you. Councillor Rob Golding, representing Oakley and North Waltham. Okay, I had hoped to avoid any mention of Manydown this evening, but I need to comment just very quickly on two of the points that we made. Firstly, when the site proposals for the site came before the EPP committee, the chief executive gave some very clear evidence based on a lot of research that building 3,000 houses over the period to 2029 would involve building faster than we'd built Chinham, faster than we'd built Hatch Warren, and faster than any comparable precedent. So I think any suggestion that we should increase the amount put forward by officers will lead us into serious trouble. Secondly, contrary to what's been said, the road issues have not been solved. There isn't an acceptable link to the motorway, and I really wish some work had been done on the roads, but it hasn't. I think it's also important that the committee remembers the market research we undertook as part of the New Homes consultation in 2011. Officers insisted that we put in a spatial question, which we did, and the results were very clear. Only 18%, 18% of the population supported one large development on the outskirts of Basingstoke town. That is evidence that will be available to the planning inspector. I commend officers for the approach taken in paragraph 6.11, page 63, in relation to BAS 121 and Hampshire County Council's attempt to mess around with the land ownership issue. Just to remind people what the judge said in the judicial review, he says, no less clear are the corresponding general principles that govern the functions of a public body as landowner, an authority's powers as the owner of land are not to be equated with those of a private landowner. It must act to further the statutory object for which it acquired and holds the land, exercising its statutory powers only for the purpose for which those powers were conferred. And Hampshire have confirmed that they acquired BAS 121 for development purposes. So they can't just try and take it out of our consideration. There is, however, one site which needs, in my view, to be taken out. And that's BAS 132, the Basingstoke Golf Course. Other speakers have already commented on that. I want to just pick up a few points. When we provisionally allocated it, is that? Yes, that's the time up, is it? Yeah. Right, goodness me, that was a very quick 2 minutes. Right, very quickly. It won't be replaced, we need it. It's uncertain because the members haven't voted. The A30 can't cope, it would cost millions to sort the A30 out. And it's far too far from Basingview, which is our strategic focus for development. Thank you.
The next speaker is Tony Durant. I have on my list, Mr. Durant, that you want Malcolm Bell to come with you, but if it's a question you're going to speak individually, then that's fine too. Can you just let me know? Okay, well, one first and then followed by the other. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Tony Durant, representing the Bramley Parish Council. We've, over the last few months, sent you a number of submissions prior to these meetings. We hope you've read them. If you haven't, we hope you do. We don't intend to reiterate too much of what's in those today, just to pick up on a few points. Isolated, flooding outside the settlement boundary, good agricultural land, poor drainage, poor infrastructure. All those words we saw on the site assessment sheets for the sites in Bramley, which include the Cufford Lane sites. They all seem to be mitigated by a whole bunch of intangible would do's, could do's, maybes, hopeful wishing, which we find disturbing. Bramley, excuse me, Bramley is split between the Cufford Lane sites, which are the 3 BAS sites, and the other 2 sites in Bramley Village. I'm not making light of the Cufford Lane sites, but everybody has heard so much about those this evening. We just really want to say we agree with what's been said about those, and we are very conscious of the adverse impacts they will have on Bramley Centre, which is the village, through adding to our problems with congestion, traffic flow generally. The other two sites, really just to focus on Bramley, we have suffered and are still suffering from the impact of the recent historic developments in Bramley, namely German Road, which was bestowed upon us by the government, not by any of the councils relative to the borough, county or parish. We have grown 3 times, we have expanded 3 times at the rate of the rest of the borough put together. That is excessive. There is no new employment, there is no change to the infrastructure. We have a train which is fantastic for people who live around Bramley but not necessarily in Bramley, and it shuts the road for most of every hour, as I'm sure people have witnessed. The consequence is the erosion of quality of life in Bramley has decreased dramatically. Our other considerations are the loss of rural character. The 2 sites in Bramley take away our only 2 northern views across countryside, and one directly impacts on the views and is adjacent to a conservation area within Bramley. So again, we have concerns over that and objections. As you know, we have applied for an NDP, and we hope to manage that allocation of 200 homes, which we welcome far more than being given a site. We hope to use that process. What Bramley Village or Bramley Parish Council really asks for is not exemption from development over time, but respite. We have absorbed so much with so little improvement in infrastructure. And what we really ask is that if development is to happen in Bramley, that it happens after we have had sufficient time to develop a credible NDP, and that it isn't a free-for-all at the beginning of the period where developers come in and everything is built. So that's our conclusion, really. We do not want exemption, we want respite to get it right. Thank you.
Malcolm Bell, please.
Mr. Chairman, my address is with respect to the 200 house allocation to Bramley and other allocated sites lying within the neighbourhood development plan designated area. The allocation of 200 houses to Bramley, we are told, can be done bottom up by the local community through neighbourhood planning. However, the choice of Bramley features around the supposed employment opportunities and accessibility in Bramley, all of which are deficient for the present population. Bramley, in assessing the allocation, has not been able to ignore the BAS sites 107, 122 and 139. They fall within the designated neighbourhood development plan boundary, which is the parish boundary, and traffic from these sites will impact considerably on the village way of life, which is already affected by the heavy traffic on the C32. Also, because the sites carry the BAS designation but lie within the parish boundary, we feel these developments will be in conflict with the adopted vision of 2026, which states communities will be flourishing, enjoying an excellent quality of life and environment, which has been improved through well-planned growth. Bramley at present will suffer, as will the residents of the neighbouring sites of this northward isolated extension. We ask the question also, if BAS 107, 122 and 139 go ahead with the BAS designation and therefore fall outside of the neighbourhood development plan area, does this mean that there will be a redrawing of the parish boundary? We also bear the question as to why Category 1 sites in the south and southwest are being undeveloped, causing pressure to develop the BAS sites within our parish, when officers state within the report that the development to the west and southwest is preferable to the north and northeast. On the 200 houses non-site allocated, Bramley will receive some finance, and through the neighbourhood development plan initiated and noted in the report, residents will be able to plan the growth of Bramley, taking note of the site classifications listed in the report. Questions concerning the developments comes from the Neighbourhood Development Plan Forum, and this is the formation of a neighbourhood development plan within an 18-month timescale acceptable to you to allow the community of Bramley Parish to decide the shape and design of the allocated expansion? If not, what is acceptable? And also, how will expected premature and competing applications for the 200 allocated houses ahead of the neighbourhood development plan be dealt with by the planning department? Thank you.
Speaker I have is Mr. Peter Baker.
Peter Baker of Overton Parish Council. I'm just going to give you some bullet points. I'm going to state the obvious. Overton is 8 miles from Basingstoke. It's surrounded by countryside. It's not an extension of Basingstoke. The B3400 that runs through the middle, it was laid down in the 13th century by Bishop Lucy, the Bishop of Winchester, and it is so narrow it is very difficult for existing volumes of traffic to pass through it. We're expecting 1,100 new houses built on the east of Andover, Pickett Piece, 300 or so at Whitchurch, and a percentage of those houses will come through our narrow streets. So we're going to kill the golden goose, which is a very vibrant a minor shopping centre with 24 different businesses, because if you overload a village and where there's nowhere to park, it doesn't actually benefit the businesses there because people just can't park. And of course the loss of the green fields around the village is very passionately thought of by the villagers who have moved there because they like walking into the countryside. Now, over the past 3 years, we've accepted 2 big housing sites, which are 175 houses, so you cannot accuse us of being NIMBYs. Now, the infrastructure is at full capacity, the water, the sewage, the schools, the doctor's surgery, and I agree with Maria Miller that we shouldn't lose our lovely green fields, and we shouldn't be used as a dormitory town for Basingstoke and London, because our railway line, of course, is only 55 minutes from the village, so it's very desirable to live there, because it's just like living on the outskirts of North London, 50 minutes on the tube. Now, the honourable member for Highclere came to speak to 90 parishioners 4 years ago in our annual public meeting and said, "Stuff and nonsense, 800 houses extra in Overton, nonsense. You'll only get 20 houses," he said, "in 15 years, and if you get all these numbers, he'll come and stand on the picket line." And he was then, of course, chair of the Housing Committee, but for some reason he got removed a few weeks after. So the people of Overton, okay, very quickly, we would like village houses for village people. We are not anti-development, but we want them for the people of Overton. Thank you.
Speaker from Overton Parish Council, is that correct? Is there someone else from Overton Parish Council who wishes to address us? Please come forward and then just identify yourself. Thank you so much.
Good evening, my name is Brian Langer, Overton Parish Council. The points I'd like to make, the Parish Council hasn't considered in detail yet the proposals that have come forward, but we thought that with the inclusion of Manydown, we would be relieved of some of the housing pressure on our community, but in fact, instead of the 120 houses within the original plan that was thrown out, we now find ourselves with a intention to develop 270 dwellings in Overton. The page 60 of the report says helps development within the smaller communities around the borough helps maintain vitality of smaller villages across the borough. There's a serious question mark over that, because instead of maintaining vitality, it probably smothers vitality. And the page 67, the second site which has come forward for development, which wasn't in the first report, mentions close to services. It is in fact a long way away from most of the services in the village. The page 75 refers to infrastructure delivery plan. Well, as has been said by a number of speakers this evening, infrastructure is a major problem because the development usually takes place, but the infrastructure never seems to come along at the appropriate time, if at all. As far as the two sites are concerned that are being proposed for Overton, OV002, Overton Hill, the proposed developers, or on behalf of the proposed developers, they've already come and made a presentation to the parish council, so the chances are that that site will go through the planning process long before this local plan process has been completed. The Overton 003, Overton 006 and 007, they're not being proposed, and I think it's important to say that based on previous discussions, the parish council would not support the inclusion, and therefore it supports the exclusion of those two sites. Overton 004, the second site being proposed, second paragraph mentions the word town. Now that is a red rag to a bull as far as Overton is concerned, and it really does personify the feeling that the borough and perhaps the officers are out of touch with what Overton actually means to the community. We are a village. We want to remain a village, and that's really the infrastructure is overloaded. The trains can't cope. The roads can't cope. The 300-400. It's not just a case of 270 houses in Overton. There's 200 being proposed for Oakley. There's 350 for Whitchurch, let alone Andover, all using the 300-400. So it's just a non-starter, really, as far as we're concerned. But that's not to say you'll think otherwise.
Councillor Mrs. Paula Baker.
Evening Chairman, evening Committee. Paula Baker, Councillor for Overton, Lovestoke and Steventon, and I wish to speak on sites 002 and 004. Okay. Right, thank you. As I said on the previous LDF, the 120 houses on site 002 that were proposed then should be at the end of the plan period rather than the beginning, because Overton needs time to settle from the high level of development that we've experienced in recent years. Well, feeling has certainly not changed in the village since I last spoke to you, and yet now we are faced with 270 more houses. Overton's a wonderful village for many reasons, particularly the wide variety of shops that we have, and the fact that we have a railway station. But the infrastructure is inadequate for either. You cannot park in the centre of the village, you cannot park at the station, and there are the water and sewage problems as well. So perhaps you might think, well, the development would fund those improvements that you seek. Well, that hasn't worked before. DC had to vary a planning condition on the Foxdown development to allow more houses to be occupied before a sewage improvement took place, because Southern Water couldn't carry out the work. Extra parking was promised at the station with the first part of the Overton Hill development, and The development is there, but we still have only a temporary provision of potholed and unlit land accessed from a potholed and private road at the station. But nevertheless, it's full every day. Access to the newly proposed site of Overton 004 at Two Gate Lane will have a profound impact on the landscape and the setting of the village. And we face the prospect at the top of the hill on the edge of the village having streetlights and perhaps a roundabout to allow that access. And that site is remote, as you heard, I believe it was Mr. Langer say. It's as far away from Overton School as you could get. So please, I'd ask you, committee, to consider recommending that the additional houses at Overton Hill be shifted back to later years of the plan. I would ask you to consider recommending the removal of the Two Gate Lane allocation, that's 004. And I would say as a final thing that if you feel there is no alternative than having Overton Hill plus additional development, then please could you consider allowing Overton to decide where that should go. We have a community plan underway at the moment, and we have done planning for additional housing in the past, and I think perhaps the village might prefer to do it rather than have a top-down imposition of a particular site. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, to those listening to this, can I just say to you that that was the last speaker on my list. Please raise a hand if you think you should have been on the list and called, and then I will deal with it. No hands have gone up. Can I thank you all for being so good at staying within the margins of the tight time constraints. Now, for your benefit, we as a committee are going to look at the early stages of the paper before we then move on to site assessment, starting with Basingstoke. I think it most unlikely we will be dealing with Bramley, Overton and other sites tonight. I'm telling you that for a straightforward reason. If you wish to leave now, please feel free to do so. We're not encouraging you to leave, of course, but I will pause the meeting for a moment in case you want to go so that the disturbance doesn't disturb us. Right, members, I think we should get going. We're going to be looking at paragraph 4, which is the housing land supply components, which, as we all know from looking at the paper on page 56 of 172, deals with two options with 730 dwellings per annum or 770 dwellings per annum. As we as members know, we've discussed those figures previously as committee, and this part of the paper just deals with putting that into practice as to how many would remain. Either 7,083 that would be required or 7,803 required in excess of the number of completions and currently available in the future suppliers listed there. I think the first thing to do under 4 is for questions to the officers. But before we do that, can I just remind members of what we have to do looking at the recommendations on page 53 of 172, chapter 2 or paragraph 2, 2.1, that we are required to note the contents of this report, including the conclusions of the site assessment work and the sustainability appraisal. We're required to make comments to the Cabinet, and this particular Cabinet member in particular, on the recommended preferred distribution, including the sites for suggested allocation and settlements, where development should be located for inclusion in the emerging local plan. To note that further work is being undertaken on transport, and this will be used to inform the contents of the draft local plan, which is intended to be presented to this committee in the spring, and to provide comments on the most appropriate approach to dealing with any shortfall in housing supply as set out in certain paragraphs, which we'll come to in due course. So on 4, I'm sure members will agree, shall we ask officers questions if you wish to do so? Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Can I look at the table for 2, please? The question I've got really relates to the robustness of the table going forward from here. You know, we've done the debates and we've had all of the thing around the table, but this is beginning now to form it into pretty much concrete as far as the Cabinet are going to be concerned, taking it forward. My question to the officers and really to the portfolio holder as well, unallocated sites in the SPD of 1,200, that figure still includes sites like the Downgrange playing fields and also includes the town centre car parks. Now, are we seriously saying that going forward to an examination in public, we are happy to include Central, Castons and so on car parks in the town centre as our suggestion as an authority that we are going to build on our car parks in the town centre? It just seems utterly ludicrous. If we're going to do that, that's fine. But if not, then that figure of 1,200 isn't robust and it needs to be reviewed. So that's really my question, seeing as we're getting to the cutting edge of the whole process.
Right, let's ask the relevant officer. Mr. Lambert, obviously excluding ridiculous and various other comments that were in there, because it almost went... So I know, but it was a sort of question going two ways. You're ridiculous if you suggest it, and you're ridiculous if you advise it. So we'll take Mr. Lambert and not Councillor Sherlock.
Thank you, Chair. The figure of 1,200 represents the sites in Appendix 3 of the SHLA, and that's those sites within the urban area, typically the brownfield sites that come forward within the main settlements. We've discounted that figure to reflect the fact that some sites won't come forward over the plan period, and equally that other sites may come forward. Obviously, it's a long-term plan, and sites, have issues, they may fall away over time, but equally there may be other unidentified sites that we aren't yet aware of. So that's how we've ended up with that 1,200 figure. And it's important to remember that this is a long-term plan, and we do have other strategies in place, like these, the car park strategy, when we've committed to look at car parking over the course of the plan going forward.
Mr. Townsend, can I remind you that if you deal with what perfectly adequate, obviously, broad brush answer, you'll get some more specific questions. So could you answer the questions on car parks in particular, which is being asked, and any other sites that were mentioned?
As I mentioned, the figure takes into account those sites within the SHLA, particularly Appendix 3, which is the brownfield sites. It does include car parks, potentially, but equally it reflects the fact that we've discounted that figure to pick up that sites will fall away and will come forward during that period.
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you. The reason for asking the question is we are getting to the cutting edge of the process. We own those sites. They're borough-owned sites. Now, either the borough council is saying, yes, we are promoting our car parks for development, or it isn't. If it is, then that creates an issue for all of the other policy areas that need to be considered. If it isn't, then why are we including them? It's not a catch-22 question. It's quite easy. Either we as the borough are saying we're doing it, or we're not.
Well, perhaps the officer can answer that in terms of, are we replacing those car parking spaces by other means?
Well, I think the important point is that they're in the SLA, they've been promoted to the local planning authority, and they've been reflected in the SLA accordingly.
But would the car parking spaces be replaced by other means?
We have a strategic approach to parking, and that sets out how the Borough Council will consider the future role of car parking in the town.
I have Councillor Tilbury next, and then a queue that's starting quite rapidly now. Okay, Councillor Tilbury.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the question to officers is obviously this committee considered the housing numbers and, well, I don't know what conclusion they came to. So we're looking at a figure of 730 to 770, the housing figure. That's the decision by the Cabinet, as it says at 4.2. Now, that decision has never gone before full council. So this council has not agreed that figure. So what happens if we move forward with this figure? Because that's all we're working on. We're not looking at 594, which would have been sensible to put that in as an option there. Well, at some point, this will go back to full council as this is our core strategy, this is our local plan, and that the councillors turn around and say, we don't even support the housing number, where are we then? Because this seems a bit of a crazy way of moving forward. The Cabinet have agreed these figures and have not the rest of the council. Surely that should have gone back to the council, and I'm pretty sure that's the way it was done the last time round in the local plan, and even in the last core strategy. So, you know, at what point will the full council sort of say, well, we will support these numbers? Because at the moment, I don't think anyone does, hardly, other than the Cabinet.
Mr. Hunter, can you answer that question? When do councillors get a say on the number, please?
In my understanding, in terms of this process, the executive decision is the going out for consultation on a plan is an executive decision, so it sits with the Cabinet. As with that, we're taking forward the number and the sites. It's the point at which the plan is submitted to government that the council as a whole has to sign up to the plan. And obviously, through the consultation, councillors can make their comments on the plan, which would be taken through the Cabinet and then ultimately to council. But it's at the point at which we submit the plan that you would decide on the overall plan in numbers, housing sites, policies, everything.
You can, Councillor Tilbury. Just remember, of course, we have had the discussion on numbers before, and I understand why you raise it, because other councillors agree with you on bringing the number down, but also there are other councillors around there who want to have the number much greater. So, you know, it's and the reasons which were put forward for the figure that is the range that's there.
I think the obvious point is that could be quite a way down the road. In the meantime, we'll be having appeals coming through. Surely it would make sense to get this decided one way or the other by full council as soon as possible, and not leave it to several months down the line. This seems suicidal to me. Thank you.
That's obviously a comment, and the portfolio holder needs to listen to what you're saying, and his ears are open, I'm sure. Okay, next was Councillor Shaw. Can I just say, Mr. Mayor, that the recommendation was on just so that anyone looking in the public eye remembers what it is we're supposed to be focusing on. I wasn't aware they actually want to see us in greater detail. But if, as you're the Mayor of the Borough, you know best, you'll see me in great Technicolor now, and others in due course. Councillor Shaw, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask officers if they viewed the webcast of the day before yesterday's Economic Prosperity Overview Committee, because I attended that meeting and the council's position seemed less than clear on the issue of these town centre car parks.
No, I haven't reviewed those.
Councillor Keith Watts, please.
Yes, on the subject of the unallocated sites in the settlement policy boundary, I would remind the committee that after all the many hours and late nights that we spent discussing the SLA, calling in the SLA, making recommendations, we were told that none of these sites were actually up for our discussion, because as they were within the settlement policy boundary, the fact that they were available was enough to draw a line under them. So we've never ever, although we're saying we're taking 1200 into account, this committee has never ever seriously discussed the merits of those sites altogether or separately. Or when we did discuss it, we found that the discussion wasn't being minuted and wasn't being carried forward.
Councillor Keith Watts, I'm perfectly content that's a comment, not a question, by the sounds of things. I'm not going to force you to make it a question because this stage it's probably good to have a bit of comment and questions, as Councillor Harvey thought fit to do to begin with. Next, Councillor Laura James, and then Councillor Gary Watt.
Thank you. I've got three questions. The first one is, and I'm not sure which site it is, whether it's Razors or Kennel, but it's coming forward as a windfall. Does it mean that obviously it's not going to be counted? In my understanding, if something gets planning permission before this plan is adopted, it will then be windfall. Is that the case? And how does that affect this table on page 56?
Right, Mr. Hunter, definition of windfall. Ms. Bromley, definition of windfall, and then the example it's given.
It would be defined as windfall because it's not identified in the supply currently, in our land supply. If it did come forward and was developed, it would then be included in our land supply as a site which had planning permission.
So in other words, the same number would just find itself in a different column. Councillor Ms. James, anything further?
Yes. In the presentation that we were given by officers, we talked about a shortfall and the possibility of identifying other sites. It doesn't actually identify that, and I think if we're going to be talking about sites and making recommendations to the Cabinet, do the officers have any ideas on what those reserved sites are and where they are? And I think it's important that we have an understanding of that. Is it in Bramley? Is it where are these reserved sites?
Hunter.
I think the recommendation is looking for you to come to a conclusion on what your approach would be, because we're not saying what site, we're saying a reserve site could be one mechanism, so could be an early review of the plan, so could be a review of SPBs, and what we're asking committee here tonight is which of those approaches would you most like officers to investigate?
So if we have a shortfall, for example, if the car parks don't come forward or a site doesn't materialise or doesn't get planning permission.
So, Mr. James, I'm so sorry. I was talking over you just to find out where that is. That's the final recommendation, the paragraph 6, whatever it is. That's why we've got to look at that in due course. All right. And so, anyway, carry on. Please make your next point or question.
But I think it's relevant in relation to the debate that we're having now. I think it's important that we consider it and think about it. So if we're talking about, tonight we just talked about car parks as an example, if that doesn't materialise, we need to consider what are we going to do and how realistic in relation to these sites coming forward is this tonight? And if not, where are these other sites going to be? There must have been some thought. Officers must have some idea on what they're going to do. And I'm not sure I understand what you want from us and how we can actually achieve that. I'm not sure I feel equipped to be able to answer that with this report in front of us. And that's one of my questions.
I think we're just simply asking you for your view on the approach we take, which is the latter thing. If you're talking about in terms of a shortfall coming about because some of the sites in the ones we're identifying in the settlement areas, the SPB, they don't come forward in that 1200 figure, what we're saying is some of those sites will come forward, they'll be tested through planning applications, others of those may never come forward, but along the process you always get new sites coming along. We wouldn't, for instance, have known that Eli Lilly was coming along, it came along and it gave you 400 houses, so it's a process that's iterative. And what we're saying is our best estimate at the moment is that those brownfield sites in the Schlar would give us at least some of those would come forward and others would replace over the period of plan.
I think Councillor Harvey just said that the MPPF says that there needs to be a buffer of 5 to 10%, and we've only got 7 houses. I mean, that I don't think equates with what we're required to do. So I just think it's a real issue that we need to be considering as a committee.
The buffer you're talking about is related to 5-year land supply, and the whole reason for asking committee to give us that view on the approach is exactly the point you make.
Councillor Ms James, we're certainly going to come back to that. And I know you will make us come back to it, but we're going to anyway because it's one of the recommendations. So any other questions in relation to 4, please?
Yeah. In relation to the table on page 58, page 56, sorry, the overall remaining requirement of 7,803 units. This report came forward in September, the equivalent report, and the figure was 3,925. We're now seeing a 100% increase in greenfield land. This government and this council have made a commitment in relation to, as did Councillor Golding, in coming forward in the number of units that will be built on greenfields. Is that the case, that we're going to see a 100% increase on greenfield development, as opposed to the report that came forward in September?
Thank you, Chair. This relates back to the extended plan period, which now takes us up to 2029, and the increased annual housing requirement.
You're being asked a maths question. I'm not quite sure how it works, but if you don't understand the question, you can ask the councillor to explain it again.
I don't have the figures in front of me from the previous plan, but if that was the requirement that was identified, then that's the case.
Councillor Gary Watts.
Thank you, Chair. On the same theme, on the unallocated sites within the settlement boundaries, I'm just wondering when officers are actually going to listen to members on this committee. I can't remember a member from this council actually supporting the allocation of car parks for housing. And also the Downgrange site. It's not a brownfield site, it's actually a playing field. And again, no member from this council, I can remember, has actually supported the recommendation to build on that. So I just want to know when you're actually going to put across what actually members' feelings are. It's more of a statement, really. My question is, on neighbourhood planning, are we going to have any within neighbourhood planning for areas? Are we going to have any within the Basingstoke area, within the settlement boundary? The 4 that are going ahead are all in rural villages. Are we going to have some in the town area?
Mr Hunter, what's the state of play on that at the moment?
My understanding, probably, Joe, do you want to answer? You know better than I.
Ms Bromley.
That's not for us to stipulate where they should be. It's for the communities to come to us and say that they want a community plan. Brookvale, for example, have come to us and we're due to meet with them in February.
Any others? Within Basingstoke, the only one is Brookvale. Councillor Peach.
Thank you. I was just seeking some clarity also on neighbourhood planning. Because if I recall correctly, there was members of the public that were saying in their villages that they would be looking at using neighbourhood planning to develop their own plan for what they want to see in development. And that would probably fall under the already allocated sites. Yet here you've put aside a further 150 for neighbourhood plans. So does that include the ones you already know about, or I just need to...
You've got the neighbourhood plans in areas like Bramley and Whitchurch where we suggest a number, but this is for other settlements. For example, we've got Sherborne St John, Sherfield on Loddon, and others may come forward where they can look at development within their own areas. So this would be in addition to those allocations.
So, again, sorry, just to clarify, so that would say that those communities that want to come forward with a neighbourhood plan for their own development will have to work with the allocated number you've already given them.
If the plan went through, in the case of Bramley and Whitchurch, yes, that's the case. They could go higher if they wanted to. That's up to them. But neighbourhood plans cannot restrict development once it's in a local plan.
So Laura James, remember we're on 4.
Yeah, it was just picking back up on the table on page 56 around windfalls and 50 per year. What it says over the page in relation to windfalls, that the inclusion of windfall allowance is justifiable for the borough, that 50 homes per year being an appropriate figure. And going back to the question that I asked, if those sites come forward that are reserve sites at the moment and get planning permission that well exceed that 50, will they still be counted, or are we only going to count 50 as per the windfall allocation? Will anything that comes forward without planning permission be counted as a number?
Any site that ultimately comes forward and gets planning permission will count towards the supply, even if it's above the 50.
Right, members, it's distribution, next 5. That has been set out in 3 parts by the officers: a Basingstoke focus for all development, a Basingstoke focus and a spread of development to larger settlements in the borough, which I listed to you earlier as Basingstoke, Bramley, Overton, Tadley, Whitchurch, Kingsclear and Oakley. Or the third approach would be spreading development across the borough to those settlements with defined settlement policy boundaries. In other words, a much more even distribution. The officers, as you can see in paragraph 5.4, have recommended a Basingstoke focus and a spread of development to larger settlements in the borough. Again, it's up to members how you wish to deal with this, but perhaps we'll try and start with questions to officers on methodology if you disagree with it or you want to support it. Otherwise, any comments in support or against what the officers have suggested so far. Over to you, members. Councillor Shaw.
Yes, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask about, for officers for a response to the issue that was raised by some members of the public about the sequential aspects of flood risk. Because I think members of the public basically saying that, they thought a sort of sequential flood risk assessment ought to be a sort of primary filter in terms of the sort of allocation process, and that was really what was required by the MPPF, and I'd appreciate an officer view on that.
Councillor Shaw, forgive me, because it probably shows my ignorance, but is this 5.4 or 5.6 or 5.2? Because that's what we're on about.
In a sense, it's all 3, because some of these options...
Do you want to expand? Well, make your point.
Are somewhat counter to, that argument that was being advanced by residents. So that was the reason for asking it at this stage.
Well, let's see. All right. We're certainly raise it any time, obviously, but I'm just saying it's getting in the right bit.
Thank you, Chair. The Appendix 4 to the report sets out the sequential assessment that's been undertaken in terms of flooding. This ranks the sites by settlement, and it ranks them in the order of that site with the most flooding issues to that site with the fewest flooding issues. So it may be worthwhile perhaps looking at this under Section 6, which is on the more site specifics, if that's helpful. But perhaps...
Can the officers make a note that we'll come back to it, please, for Councillor Shaw, and Councillor Shaw will make a note that we are going to. Councillor Harvey, on this topic, please.
I'm going to sneak a suspicion on the basis of what you just said. My question's probably got more relevance to 6, but I'll do it under 6, but I don't want to lose the point that the spatial distribution choices are linked. They're inherently linked.
Free confidence, you'll remember. Anyone else on 5 at the moment? Well, oh yes, Councillor Tilbury, go on.
I think the first one that we should develop it all in Basingstoke is obviously inequitable, as it says there. I think anyone would support that, and I think it was a red herring when we keep saying that people said, oh, they didn't want an MDA. What they were actually asked, the question was, do you want all the houses in the borough in one place? Well, hardly anyone's going to say that. I wouldn't support that. I don't think every house in Basingstoke should be on many down. But I don't think the option we're going for makes much sense either, because it basically just spreads development to Basingstoke and any larger settlements, which just means they keep getting bigger all the time. I think the last one, 5.6, to the ones with defined settlement boundaries, makes far more sense. And I did some work looking at the populations in all the parishes across Basingstoke and Dean, going back to the 1950s and 1969, through the old Kingsford and Whitchurch Rural District Council, their handbooks, and the old Basingstoke rural ones there. And over half the parishes in Basingstoke and Dean have got lower populations now than they had in 1955 and 69. And I'm not talking about a few numbers. You know, you're looking at places like Borghurst of 72 people less. Berkeley are the same. St Maryborn, 94 less people than it had in 1969. Now, that's largely because there's been no development in any of these places there. Whereas if you look at the more obvious ones like Bramley and, you know, Oakley and places like and Overton, they've all gone up by thousands, because what we're doing, people are being pushed out of the countryside to the smaller villages because there is very little development there, and they're being forced into the either into the larger conurbation or the larger villages, small towns, Overton, Tadley, those sort of places, or they're being forced into Basingstoke. And that's just making the situation worse, because the next time we look at it again, we say, oh, there's no infrastructure in these places, and they're a bit small, and, oh, just build it in Overton or Whitchurch because it's easier, or Basingstoke. And that's just going to keep carrying on. It'll just get worse and worse until they eventually become swallowed up by Basingstoke and overrun completely. I think we should be looking at a different option altogether, you know. And it's not, no one's suggesting you should build 50 houses in a place like Hannington or somewhere like that, but there is scope in these places to build houses. But if you go around most of these small villages, you can probably see the last houses that were built, and they were probably in the 50s or the 60s. And other than the odd little one in someone's garden, possibly, there has been no development at all. It's like they're pickled in aspic, all these little places. We don't want them all to grow, but there could be a little bit of development there, because the difference is we're just getting massive development and ruining the other villages. And all that'll happen is they'll just spread over them, you know. The reality is we just don't want this level of development, but for some reason the Cabinet think it's a good idea.
Just them, is it? As you know, the government still has us on 945, the previous government figure. So, right, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you very much.
Diane Taylor.
Thank you,
If I
yes.
don't do that, someone will think you've got
Yes.
a goatee beard or something.
Right. Every speaker I've heard speaking this evening has abhorred urban sprawl. Nobody likes urban sprawl. North, south, east, and I'll add in west, we don't like it. And I'm actually agreeing quite a lot with Ian tonight. I would prefer to mitigate the urban sprawl that we've seen threatening our villages and our communities by judiciously and sensitively extending the boundaries of some of our villages. This is to enhance them, not to spoil them. And we've seen it working, as some of the communities you've mentioned, with Oakley, with Overton, with to a lesser extent Sherborne, St John, and some of the others. I would rather see communities carefully expanded than swallowed up in urban sprawl. And I believe in the English village, I really do. And I believe that the better way of preserving our English village is to create them, especially the ones that are closest to town, to sensitively create larger communities that are discrete communities where you have a sense of belonging, where you have a sense of identity, where you have a sense of pride, than just have them, as we've seen with some of our villages, as just swallowed up in the main massive town. So I would prefer to see us option 2, but veering towards option 3, so that we do actually have a greater spread throughout the borough.
Before we come to the next speaker, can I just ask officers this question? Can you just remind the committee of how many houses you are working on that would be built in villages through the planned period that are currently unallocated but you think might come forward? Because there is a figure, isn't there?
Essentially, that would be picked up in the neighbourhood planning figure, which is about 150, and then anything that would come through windfalls, which would be through the exceptions policy, neighbourhood planning, or changes to the settlement policy boundaries. So those would all be picked up in the plan through that way.
So, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that, but I mean, obviously 150 in the broad spectrum of things is peanuts. I would have more settlement policy boundaries. I mean, maybe then we could have a few more Colkinnon type houses being allowed to build at least one house in their gardens.
Pausing there for members for a moment. Is it the mood of the members that we suspend standing orders and keep this meeting going, but certainly finish it before 10 o'clock? Yes? Can I have a proposer, seconder, who are happy, say aye? And I think what we'll say to members of the public, because they need to get away, we're not going to start discussing Basingstoke sites tonight, I'm afraid, members, public. I think you should be told that as soon as possible. We've clearly got a little more conversation to deal with distribution, and it's better we bat it around as much as we need to without feeling as though we need to skip it and start the topic, which we're not going to finish tonight in any event. So if you want to leave us, please feel free to do so. Councillor Diane Taylor, will you want to come back on anything on that?
No, I've just spoken. That's, I think, probably all I've got to say
All right.
at this time. Thank you.
I will come back to Councillor Tilbury in a minute on what he said, but Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'll make these comments now, and I'll pick up what I was going to say because it fits in with what's been said. I agree with Councillor Taylor and Tilbury in terms of the general direction of travel, of trying to unpick, in essence, I'm going to use the word dog breakfast, really, the choices we've got in front of us. It really is difficult. And I'm looking at what the officers have said about northwest versus southwest versus west, and you look at the balance of that and what's said in the report in the section 6 in comparison to the way it's described in section 5. There's no consistency to it, in all honesty. And I know it's difficult because you say you want a northwest, a southwest focus, and then you create what's being created in Chinham, which is an MDA. We are creating an MDA. You can't spin it in any other way. It is an MDA. You know, Manydown has the potential to achieve, in ways of spatial distribution and in ways of strategic planning, that cannot be achieved in the same way in and around the current proposals for Chinham. It just can't be achieved. So in the context of which one do you pick, that organic growth element, in the sense of what you're saying, draw the settlement policy boundaries around the villages and allow them to grow organically, may well create a larger housing figure, but a far more acceptable one, because those villages are being allowed to grow at a rate that they want to grow at, that they see as being far more sustainable to themselves. Now, the issue I've got with the figures, and again it's the spatial distribution, Chair, is this 40% figure. And if you live in Whitchurch, or you live in Overton, or you live in other places, the idea of taking the housing need, then using the multiple of 40%, because that's our figure, to achieve your housing number, seems difficult to defend, because are you genuinely saying that those people who are in housing need are actually going to get a house? They're not. Of course they're not, because developers aren't going to produce that. And those people on our register can't access the housing, and that's the fundamental problem. So what you're going to wind up with is developers using those figures in a way that we don't intend. It's an unintended consequence of our action because of the way we're choosing to do it. The figure isn't really real, because that's not the development that's going to happen. Not in the spatial way that we want it to, even if we chose one of these options in 5. Because that's just not what the developers are going to do. And in relation to the affordability housing, you're going to have them trying to get out of their Section 106 agreements. You're going to have them try and get out and default on viability grounds. So why are we choosing the housing needs in that way to justify the argument? It's just unreal. So for me, to be honest with you, I want to support both of the other speakers and say, actually, I've got a fundamental problem with the whole approach. The problem we've got is the quashed core strategy and the pickle that we're in over that. The pressure of applications coming forward which will force our hand. So I'm worried about spatial distribution in these choices, because we're going to have applications come forward from developers on Kennel, on Razors and all the others. They'll be windfall. They won't count as the greenfield anymore because they'll be given, they'll be through, unless we oppose them. If we oppose them, but we're saying yes in the plan, and we've said yes to a particular spatial strategy, Chair, then we're undermining our argument, because their lawyers will sit in the planning appeal and blow us out the water. I really don't understand at the moment, with all due respect to the officers, how we can go forward with 5 and 6 in the way they've described with certainty and deal with that issue. Now, until we can resolve that to some satisfaction, I think, to quite a lot of us sat around the table, I'm guessing, and to a lot of the speakers this evening, this isn't really going to go anywhere. It's kind of, in the air. And meanwhile, the developers are busy, happy doing the thing outside of this whole process. So, I mean, those are the concerns I've got, and I'm trying to articulate them in a constructive way, but nonetheless, I think support both Councillor Taylor and Tilbury.
Well, I think we'll just ask for some officer advice to explain exactly why they adopted this approach, and that might help us here, please.
Section 5, you've got various tables that give you the opportunities and basically issues. The issue we had with the final option, which is the spread it all about, if you like, was when we did the consultation with communities seeking to see whether they were interested in developing small amounts of housing in local areas. We had very limited support for that from parishes, and we went out, as you'll remember, across the whole borough in doing that. We'd also have some worries about the overall delivery of the plan if you were starting to eat away at the numbers and you were trying to say, well, we might do it here, we might do it there, but it's all down to individual communities coming forward. The approach we've taken is one where you have some
particular allocations which will deliver over the time period. We're factoring in the fact that there are windfalls. We're factoring in that neighbourhood planning can happen. We are factoring in that there's opportunities for rural exceptions, which now have a market element to them if our policy goes through. So all of those things, in combination with the distribution that we've suggested, we feel is the most deliverable and the most robust that we could take forward to a planning inspector.
Since you've one of the people, and then I'll ask Councillor Tilbury in a minute as well.
I mean,
to set the ball rolling.
In many ways, you blind me with science when you speak in planning terms, because obviously but you seem to be talking about inviting villages. I mean, obviously we do invite villages to put in neighbourhood plans and choose to have more homes, but that isn't how it happens with places like Oakley and Overton and places like that. We make a decision that we want so many houses built, we're going to extend the borders of the SPB, and that will be done. And all I'm saying is, if we've done it for them, is it not possible to do it perhaps in a smaller way, but some of the other villages that are close to the town, so that we can actually, I think, preserve them from being swallowed up? We're just about managing to stop Oakley and Sherborne St John from being swallowed up, but we're seeing Worthing disappear down the plug hole. And I don't want that to happen to any more, and I think this might be the only way of doing it.
Councillor Mr. Saylor, do you want to identify which villages you're talking about, or not really? It's not Sherborne St John, which is...
I don't want to alarm people, but I mean the ones that are around, St Lawrence, Steventon, Dean, villages to the north. I mean, I don't know. I'm just suggesting a few that are not far from the town and have roads that will feed into the town, but...
sort of play devil's advocate, is it not the same problem in reverse? You either extend the town and increase the transport problems and all the rest of it, or you extend the village and create the same problems on the same roads, just going in reverse, or probably not in reverse.
Well, my argument is nothing actually to do with roads. My argument is to do with the preservation of the English village and to prevent the straw from swallowing them up and they lose their identity. I believe in community, I really do. I think when you belong to a community, you have a greater sense of responsibility. When you can identify yourself with a discrete community. And I think we should be looking to do that, even creating, my friend has suggested a new village somewhere, I mean, like Prince Charles does, I think it's healthy. I think it's much healthier than having this grey mass extending out in tentacles in all directions and swallowing up discrete communities. I would prefer to preserve them by enlarging them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, it sort of says it on the top of page 61, as Diane's just said. This may be contrary to the neighbourhood planning approach, given that this may result in the Borough Council forcing communities to accept a level of development across the borough when the approach should be based on the bottom up. Well, but only for very small villages. For the larger ones, and for Basingstoke to a certain extent, well, you're going to get what you're given. But if you look at the map of the borough, I was just finding one, we haven't got one of these papers there, but if you look at all this development that's going to take place, with the possible exception of Whitchurch, which is probably about, well, that's sort of over that side on the western side of the village, of the borough. All this development is going to take place on the eastern side. If you include Overton and Oakley, and the massive developments are all around the Basingstoke area. And yet all these places like Wootneel, Penwood, and Burton, the places you rarely ever go to, that are actually on the edge of Newbury. So a lot of their housing requirement is actually based on people who live in Newbury. I used to work in Newbury. A lot of the people I work with lived in all those little places there. So it's not even they're not going to meet borough need. No one's going to drive here every day, are they? It would cost you a fortune. So there's a lot of things we could do in those areas there, but we're not suggesting you should build thousands of houses anywhere, but at least give them the option. And we've seen this at the beginning of this meeting. We've had the parish council from Newnham, up Nately or whatever, and we've had it with other ones saying we don't have a problem with building this house here, or these houses, or even a few there. But they're not being given the option because we're saying, sorry, there's a policy that says you can't build in the countryside. And if you haven't got a settlement policy, you're all in the countryside. And we've had that in Overton. There are sites that are actually in the countryside that are actually quite close to the village that we wouldn't mind seeing be developed on a small scale, but we don't want hundreds of, it seems crazy that we can, you can't build one house in a large piece of land, but you can build several hundred there and totally ruin the area. It seems totally contradictory, and it isn't what people are asking for. People generally aren't that NIMBY-ish. Most people can accept there's a need for affordable housing or even for private housing for people who can't afford to live in the area there, but what they don't want is these massive developments that just ruin the existing area. And we talk about things like quality of life and all these nice words in the plan, but We just ignore all them. I mean, how do we actually improve the quality of life for the people who already live here? We're not. We're making it worse. They keep telling us that, but we just don't listen. Thank you, Chair.
That one of the options in the paper is to look at reviewing the settlement policy boundaries under item 6.58 across the borough, and so we can come on to that in due course. Can I ask you this, and it's not meant to be a silly question, it's meant to be a constructive question, because we are making comments that the portfolio holder's got to take on board, and if we can give him facts or opportunity or evidence to build upon the ideas that we have and the views that you're putting forward. Bear in mind we are where we are. How do we come up with a figure for what this extra amount should be in the village? Because it sounds to me as though, certainly your view and Councillor Diane Taylor's view is, we're not abandoning the the position that the officers have come up with. We're not saying totally spread it equally across all the villages, but what you are saying is a little bit more towards the villages and come up with, but for our purposes, we need to come up with numbers as well as principles. How would you suggest that those numbers are, we arrive at those numbers? Bear in mind, obviously, they've got some notional numbers already, which we've just referred to.
You've hit the nail on the head. It is a problem if you're trying to get numbers, but we should be about building communities, not providing housing numbers. And that's what we're doing, isn't it? We're saying we've got to build these. I've argued about the housing numbers, and Andrew knows. I think they're if you go back to the way we used to do housing, we built lots of houses in the post-war period because people were living in overcrowded conditions, i.e. the average household size was very high, so therefore you built more houses. We're now being told that we've got to build more houses because the average household size is falling. Where's the logic in that? It makes absolutely no sense. We need to be building houses to meet housing need. We know many people are on the register, but nobody would realistically get a house or qualify or can afford the rent. We don't really know any of the answers to these questions. And what is the real demand? It is difficult.
It is difficult. I want to see if we can press this out, because if I'm not saying there is an overall mood, there may not be. Councillor Gardner, I know Councillor Shaw wants to speak as well. But what I want to do is, if we're going to say, well, the officers should go away and have a think about squeezing a bit more out of the villages, how are we going to suggest that? And I know they don't just turn around and say, well, that's their job. It isn't, if we're at a stage where we ought to be coming up with constructive reasons and ways of doing these things and indicating which particular villages we ought to be looking at. I know that one or two have said Highclere and St Maryborn, but there may be particular reason, or wherever it was, maybe particular reasons why they said that. So can we start with Councillor Shaw if it's on that, and then I'll move to Councillor Gardner and then back to Councillor Diane Taylor.
I'd go for the middle option, but give villages the option in terms of amending the settlement policy boundaries. I think the third option goes too far because it risks sort of stirring up a hornet's nest, really, and smacks too much of top-down for fairly marginal benefit, I suspect.
Councillor Shaw, just so we're all clear of that, you're saying you would go for the middle option with giving the villages the options to expand their settlement policy boundaries as needed. Now, that's clear, that's positive. Moving on from that, are any of the members who've spoken about this wanted to take a more proactive view to those settlement policy boundaries expanding? Because if the answer is no, there's not much else we can do on that. If the answer is yes, suggest. Councillor Tucker, please.
I just want to say some villages haven't got SPBs, have they? And I think it probably might be helpful if they did, or at least ask them if they would like them.
Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Talking about numbers, if we look at the villages, I can see organic growth of at least 50 dwellings a year over a 15-year period, which is a number of 750, which could be fed into these numbers. It represents about 10% of the total requirement, which could well mean that a bigger development elsewhere is not required.
Sorry, 50 a year, did you say? 50 times 15. And Councillor Gardner, can you explain how you come up with those figures, please?
Purely a subjective assessment. But what do you expect? You're asking me to go around village by village trying to say how many houses are going to be required. I can't do that here. It's going to be something that has to be discussed with the villages, but it's not an unreasonable number.
Mr. Hunter, do you want to comment on that as comparison to what the assumptions you made already?
Just to say, in terms of asking villages how much housing they would like to see, we did do that through the New Homes consultation, and I think we had a very limited response. Certainly nothing like 50 a year. I think we had 2 or 3 that said they might have 10, something like that, but it wasn't anything as conclusive of that kind of figure. I think in some ways we're jumping ahead a little to the options in terms of dealing with the shortfall, of which settlement policy boundary review is one of the options that we're suggesting to you as members as one way of dealing with that.
Well, we are, and I know you appreciate that members feel that the next stage is look through the prism of these 3 things, and you've obviously understandably have picked one of them. So that's I suspect why members want to just labour this a little bit. Councillor Mrs. Taylor, you did sort of vaguely indicate you were going to say something on this, and then I'll come to Councillor Harvey.
I think it's just the way you're expressing it, really. If I may say, you're talking about, I think, quote you by saying you were talking about squeezing a bit more out of our villages. That is just totally not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about not about bumping up numbers, but preventing the iniquity of the urban sprawl. And I'm talking about preserving our village communities by enhancing them. And as Councillor Gardner says, it's not something we can just suddenly come up with solutions here. It requires research and looking at infrastructure and all sorts of things. And I dare say not many villages are going, oh yes, I'll have a couple more hundred, thank you. Well, Oakley isn't saying that either, but we're being given a couple more hundred. And I just think, maybe we should spread it out a little bit more. And in the end, it's to preserve our villages and our communities, and that's the long. We need to start looking long term, don't we? We're always looking knee-jerk, short term. Long term, we will be preserving communities, and that's what we need to start looking at.
Okay, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with that. And I think the issue here is the analysis that needs to be done. That community consultation that took place is out of date, and it's out of date in a different context as well, in the old Quash local plan. Yes, you're trying to use it, and I know why the officers are trying to use it, and I respect all of that. You've got the evidence base you've got, and it ain't the greatest in the circumstances we've got on a number of areas. But in the context of this, I think a reasoned, proper, well thought out approach, as has been articulated by colleagues around the table, to the villages, to the parishes, where they are invited to contribute to this process in the way that's been described, would be very beneficial. Because they're being invited to contribute, and if they are with us on this, that gives us an opportunity for the 10s, the 5s, the 15s, the different sizes of village, the different quality of what they require and need over a 15-year period, that long-term planning option. And it might just give us the 700 or 1,000, who knows? But what it also needs, and this is the other point about the urban sprawl and the other development sites, is that if you draw a settlement policy boundary around the villages, and if you do that, the issue we then still have is that we have greenfield proposed sites that still coalesce, that still bring communities together. It's still going to link Bramley to Chinham. You're going to wind up going up the A33 and seeing it sprawl up the A33 as much as it's going down the M3. Effectively, if you look at the map, the thing is interesting, and other colleagues have said this over many, many years, Basingstoke is just spreading along the M3. Now, I know that creates an issue, and I know from your own ward, Chair, in the context of the Candovers, nothing south of the M3 as a major strategic development. But if we're going to talk strategically, then we need to talk on that scale and discount that or not in the context of the whole in the kind of way that's being described. And we've not done that. I don't think anything about this plan, aside from many down, for all the reasons we've said, is strategic. I really don't. I think it's piecemeal. So let's go out to the villages. Let's do that analysis. Let's use the opportunity we've got to refresh the evidence base while we can.
Councillor Shaw. I'm sorry, Councillor Keith Watts, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. On the matter of letting the villages grow, the last planning inspector deleted lots of settlement policy boundaries, including parish I represent, Hurstbourne Priors. But they were quite offended. They thought he was saying they weren't a village. I explained it just means that as a people they're going to die out, the buildings will crumble to rubble and the forest will take over. No, they don't. No. So we could put that in reverse. But this government, with all of its wonderful aims and so on, has made such a complete mess of neighbourhood planning. And I've sat in listening to Whitchurch Town Council struggling, and Joanne is doing a wonderful job giving advice to people. But it's an enormous deterrent to having a local a neighbourhood plan when you look at all the hoops you have to jump through. Is it possible we could develop a sort of neighbourhood plan light that could be delivered to any community that knows it wants to control its change, but can do it quite simply, and then we as a borough council, because that's what those people want, accept it into our plan? It would be rebellious, no doubt, but I really feel if we're going to get communities engaged and involved, we've got to give them something straightforward that's going to take slightly less than 15 years and cost something less than £100,000.
Councillor Miller.
Technical question for the officers. We're talking about settlement policy boundaries, and I've just heard the observation by Councillor Keith Watts across the table that the inspector deleted settlement policy boundaries. Who is the authority for settlement policy boundaries? Is it this borough? Is it the LPA? Is it the villages? Because that's been alluded to. Who controls the definition of SPVs?
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Chair. We, as a local planning authority, determine where has SPBs, and that was the process we went through with the last local plan. We had identified settlement policy boundaries around various villages in the borough. The inspector didn't feel that these villages were sustainable. He recommended in his report that we delete those settlement policy boundaries, and the council agreed with him.
Not all villages, just some that were, occasional houses grouped together in parishes where there might still be a church. Councillor.
Can I just explore that point now? Yeah, sharing Keith's point about his and colleagues' government and our government before in terms of strategic planning and the inspector that did that. If the change in localism is such that the local plan inspector will make recommendations of how we change our local plan, are his suggestions or her suggestions binding now, or do we have the opportunity, if we chose to say no, thank you very much, we have the evidence to proceed? Where's that balance at the moment? And I know that depends a lot on where a lot of the local plans are going, because I know from case law point of view, I think the evidence is beginning to pile up with other authorities trying to go down that way.
Mr. Hunter.
The inspector's report is no longer binding, but the experience we're seeing from elsewhere is that the majority, what happens is, if the inspector has concerns about soundness, they're likely to ask the local authority to make changes to their plan and reconsult on those. And in doing so, that would make the plan sound. If there was a recommendation, most of those changes, admittedly, are come through the dialogue, through the examination. If we as an authority didn't like what the inspector said, and he was saying if you don't do those things the plan wouldn't be sound, then we couldn't proceed to adoption. So you have to have a sound plan to enable you to adopt. And if the inspector is saying you're not in a sound position, you can't do so.
Right, members, we're just getting to a crucial time. What I want to do in a moment is to gather the comments together. I should say, because I haven't said much, that I support what Councillor Shaw has said. The option that the officers have with the allowing villages to stretch and expand their settlement policy boundaries if they've got them, and obviously hopefully we've got policies in place that allow them, if they either through neighbourhood plans or other things, if they decide that they don't have settlement policy boundaries but need new housing, they're in a position where they can agree it among themselves and bring it before this council for agreement. I don't support any sense of coercion from top downwards, and I don't actually see any method that despite not trying to impose it, no one is suggesting imposing it, I accept that, but I don't actually see any other way of dealing with it apart from it coming up from below. Now, I was going to ask Mrs. Brimacombe, because of the time, Councillor Harvey, to summarise what we've said. Yes, go on.
Ask you in terms of the numbers, if that was the case, does that give us an opportunity then, Chair, do you think, to capture a number in the way that Councillor Gardner described, or others may have intimated, that would be different and could add to the list?
My assumption was, should the parishes come back during the consultation period and start saying, well, actually, no, you never know, if we actually want to do this and this and this and this, the officers will adjust the plan accordingly. And of course, if this develops over the next 5 years, within 5 years' time, we can adjust the plan ourselves when we review it. One assumes we're anticipating doing that anyway, with other things that may be going on in the plan. So it's not a sort of set in stone dead plan, as we all know. Mrs. Brimacombe, could you summarise, capture the comments, and then we'll close this particular...
It's always a challenge for the end of the night. I'm trying to pick up the comments that you are looking for us to put forward in the supplementary cabinet report. So on section 4, the two things that you seem to be saying was that you would suggest that there's further clarity sought on the council's proposed approach re car parks, because you're questioning whether that affects the 1,200 figure that we've included, and you're also asking for cabinet to consider if there would be merit in the housing number going to council in advance of the stage that the officers described to you. Then that's all I had on section 4. The rest seem to be questions. On section 5, what I've come up with is that while supporting the middle option, you would suggest that we give villages the option to extend SPBs or introduce them if they don't have them. What I couldn't quite get clarity on was whether you were saying it was in the case that it would help preserve the village and prevent urban sprawl, or whether you would only do it if they would welcome it, which I think is a subtle difference.
Well, it's going to be the village's agreement, isn't it? No one's suggesting doing anything without their agreement in the circumstances that we've discussed. Yes? Yes. Anyone want to say anything different? Councillor Shaw?
The same, really, in the sense that I think the two are not necessarily incompatible, in the sense that you can, the council at borough level can say, look, we have a requirement in terms of numbers that we need to meet, and that's part of our rationale here. But at the same time, and that's why we're asking you the question about whether you might choose, from your perspective, in the interest of your village, to look at the issue of the settlement policy boundary, in a voluntary way. And I think that, there's the potential for mutual benefit.
Just Taylor.
I would agree that seems to be the mood of what everyone's saying. Personally, I would be much more strategic than that and much more intentional than that. But I don't think that's my personal opinion. I think the mood is, though, to just go as far as inviting villages. Would you like a little bit more? It's not quite what I was saying, but it's something, isn't it?
Yes, I'm looking at the clock.
If we're asking villages, would you like a little bit more, or asking in relation to their need, what's the impact on those sites that have been identified? Are we saying that if we then say, would you like a little bit more in Dummer, you then may not get this site? Or we're saying we will reduce this site back down by this amount. I mean, is there any incentive to villages coming up with a figure, or are we just actually saying we're going to have a higher number? I mean, why are we doing it?
Because it's their choice. It's bottom up. If they want it, they're going to ask us for it. That's what it comes down. And it then goes into it's factored in, isn't it? And consequences will come if they suddenly. But isn't it? But very surprised they're going to say.
It is factored
just a minute.
Sorry.
I think it's very unlikely they're going to say they want thousands of houses. All right. I'm very surprised it's going to come back as hundreds. It'll be 4 or 5 here, 1 or 2 there, and just occasionally someone will say half a dozen.
If it is factored in, what is the impact on the site allocations? And, are we going to say, if it is factored in, that we would look again at, or is it that we would then just have additional numbers? Because once we factor it in, it means a higher number. And I think it's important that we understand that.
Well, Mr. Hunter answered. I thought I had.
Just in terms of the end of the report, we talked to you about the shortfall, and obviously if we're having to meet the 770 figure, there's a shortfall, which you mentioned earlier. So that would go to contributing to giving us that buffer that you were talking about at the start of the meeting, to enable us to plan and have a delivery mechanism that enabled development to take place over the whole plan period.
To finish this topic, and we'll now, next time we meet, of course, we'll deal with the site assessment, the sites and judging them by the assessment criteria. First thing we'll be dealing with on Monday, reminding you, of course, it's you only who can attend, and no one else in your stead. Unfortunately, I'm sure you might think. And we'll deal with the planning application first at 6:30. The planning officers will obviously be here as well, and you may want to mull over the various options and the considerations that you've got in relation to that in the meantime. Thank you all. Safe journey home, and let's hope there's no snow before you get home. Can I say this? There will be an email, members, going out about round 3. Because it seems to me that it's always better to have an extra meeting planned, because it's better to cancel one than to not have one planned at all. So I think the officers will send a round 3 email. Oh, if it's not, yeah, but no, but well, I think we better have a round 3 meeting anyway.